I didn't know what frostbite felt like until that night, when the people I loved the most tossed me out of my own childhood home like I was seasonal trash. I was shivering on a park bench, clutching a half-broken suitcase, when I gave away the last warm thing I owned, my boots, to a stranger who looked moments away from dying. And exactly 1 hour later, 19 black BMWs glided toward me in perfect formation. Silent, eerie, deliberate. That stranger stepped out of the center car wearing diamonds and a coat that cost more than my entire existence. And she said the one sentence that changed everything. I've been watching you long enough to know exactly who you really are. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you've ever been dismissed, humiliated, or replaced in your own family, hit like, subscribe, and drop your state or city in the comments. This story, it's going to hit a nerve you didn't even know was raw. My name is Elia Vance, and I always believed Christmas Eve had a kind of magic to it. Not the sparkly Hallmark kind, the quiet kind. The kind that makes you think maybe the year wasn't so bad, maybe things are finally going to turn around. But this year, the magic arrived wearing fangs. It started at 10:03 a.m. with an email subject line that drained the blood from my face. Notice of termination, effective immediately. 6 years at the San Francisco ad agency. My soul poured into campaigns that won awards nobody bothered to hand me. My weekends sacrificed, my vacations canceled. And yet the email read like a polite apology for being a burden. Due to ongoing restructuring. Thank you for your service. Return your badge by noon. I remember sitting in my Honda Civic, 12 years old, dented on the passenger side, staring at the decorative succulent I had just yanked off my desk. Its leaves were shaking from how hard my hands trembled. I wasn't angry yet. The rage would come later. Right then I was just tired, exhausted down to my bones. So I drove home. Hillsborough, the neighborhood where the street lamps alone cost more than my entire student loan debt. 32 miles south. 47 minutes if traffic played nice, which it didn't. I called my mom in the parking garage. Hey, I said, trying to sound steady. I got laid off. I think I need to come home for a week or two. Just to regroup. Mom, dinner's at 7. She mumbled, distracted. Drive safe. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I should have heard the warning in her tone. I should have sensed the shift. But I needed, to believe home was still home. When I walked through those massive double doors, it didn't feel like home. It felt like I had walked straight into a magazine spread. A 15-foot noble for glittered under chandeliers. White orchids spilled from every marble surface. Waiters in tuxedos circled the dining room, laying out gold-trimmed china. My father, Langston Vance, real estate mogul, the man who taught me to never show weakness, was uncorking Dom Perignon 2005 like it was tap water. My mother, Ophelia, always immaculate, was fastening a new strand of South Sea pearls around her neck. And my younger sister, Vivica, was twirling in a backless red silk gown, flashing a 6-carat diamond like she'd been waiting her whole life for a spotlight. Behind her stood Darius, my ex. Her fiancé now, apparently. For a second my breath just left my body. I tried to smile. Tried to sound normal. Hey y'all. Rough day at work. Vivica spun, gasping dramatically. Oh my God, again? 3rd job in 4 years, right? Her voice was honey-coated venom, loud enough for the staff to hear. I swallowed hard. It was a reduction in force, Viv. They let the whole creative team go. She waved her ring in my face like it was a royal scepter. Darius just closed his series of funding, she said brightly. 28 million valuation. Investors adore him. Darius squeezed her waist and smirked. The same smirk he wore when he dumped me 2 years ago. It's not you, he'd said. It's the timing. My father finally turned toward me. Elia, we need to talk. He didn't gesture for me to sit. He never did when the news was bad. He told me, coldly, formally, that he had amended the family trust. Last month. Every penny. Every property. Every asset. $38 million. All of it now belonged to Vivica. Irrevocably. Signed. Notarized. Filed. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. I'm your firstborn, I said quietly. Why would you do that? You're 32, he replied. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. My mother added without looking at me. We can't keep supporting a lifestyle that doesn't produce results. A lifestyle? My studio apartment? My Goodwill furniture? My frozen Trader Joe's meals? But they weren't finished. My father's voice sharpened. You have 20 minutes to pack what you need. Security will let you back inside tomorrow to collect the rest by appointment. It took me a full 3 seconds to understand what he meant. He was kicking me out. Tonight, on Christmas Eve. When I went upstairs, my childhood bedroom felt like a cruel museum. Posters still on the walls, swim team medals still hanging, everything preserved except the girl I used to be. I packed like I was being timed. Jeans, sweaters, laptop, toothbrush. The floor felt like it was dissolving under my feet. When I came back down, a sound froze me. Vivica, recording live on Instagram. And here she comes, she chirped. The prodigal daughter returns, with one sad little bag. Any bets on how long before she's sleeping in that rusty Civic? Her followers erupted in laughing emojis. I wanted to scream. But instead, I just walked. Dad opened the door himself. The fog poured in like icy smoke. Merry Christmas, Vivica sang sweetly. Don't freeze. The door shut behind me with a soft, final click. The alarm armed itself. That was the moment my family became strangers. The cold hit me like a physical blow the moment the door sealed shut, as if the warmth of that house had been pumped away by a vacuum. The fog was thick, swallowing the end of the driveway, muffling every sound except the rasp of my own breath. For a moment I just stood there, holding my suitcase, staring at the immaculate wreath on the door. It looked so festive, so inviting, like a joke the universe thought was funny. I forced my legs to move. The suitcase wheels rattled across the marble porch, then the perfect pavement of the cul-de-sac. The cold air wrapped around my lungs like barbed wire. Every house I passed glowed with warmth, gingerbread houses in real life. Families laughing inside. Kids running around. Windows full of golden light. Not a single window was mine. Not anymore. The tears came slowly at first, hot against my freezing cheeks, then faster until they blurred the world. I kept wiping them away with the back of my hand, but they just kept falling, freezing before I could even catch my breath. This can't be real, I whispered to no one. This can't be happening. But it was. I walked for what felt like forever, though it might have only been 20 minutes, until I reached the tiny public garden next to the old Episcopal church. A small iron bench sat under a flickering street lamp. I sank onto it, clutching myself for warmth, feeling the metal leaching the heat straight from my bones. My stomach twisted with that painful, hollow ache that comes right after betrayal. Not heartbreak. Betrayal. There's a difference. Heartbreak is grief. Betrayal is humiliation. I cried for the girl who used to wake up at 5 a.m. to study because she didn't want to disappoint her father. For the girl who covered for Vivica countless times, who protected her, defended her, sacrificed for her. For the woman who worked herself half to death hoping her parents would finally say they were proud. The cold made everything sharper. Colder. More real. And that's when I heard it. A soft, dragging shuffle. Bare feet on concrete. I looked up. An elderly woman stood a few feet away, swaying slightly, her silver hair tangled and wild, her skin pale and stretched thin over her bones. Her toes were nearly blue, her ankles swollen and raw from the cold. She looked like winter itself had been hunting her. "Miss," she said softly, voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you know if any shelters still have space?" Her question cracked something open in me. I shook my head. I don't have anywhere to go either. She nodded like she understood too well, and slowly lowered herself onto the bench beside me, leaving a small, polite distance like she was afraid to intrude. We sat there in silence, two strangers who didn't belong anywhere. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, and that purple shade in her feet terrified me. Frostbite isn't just cold. It's death creeping in quietly. Before I could stop myself, I stood up. My fingers trembled as I unbuttoned the long cashmere coat, my last real possession of value. The last shield between me and the cold. I wrapped it around her shoulders gently, like an instinct, like breathing. She gasped softly as the warmth cocooned her. "Oh, child," she whispered. "Why would you?" "Because you look colder than I feel," I said. "And I'll be okay." I wasn't okay. Not even close. But she needed it more. She took my hands, held them tight between hers. Her skin felt like thin paper, her touch surprisingly firm. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elia." She repeated it slowly, like it meant something sacred. Then she squeezed my hands once, looked into my eyes with an intensity that made my breath hitch. And she left, walking with surprising steadiness into the night, disappearing like a ghost. After she vanished, the cold swallowed me whole. My body shook violently. My teeth clattered so hard my jaw ached. But, strangely, the pressure in my chest eased. A tiny flicker of warmth, emotional, not physical, settled under my ribs. Like I had done one small thing right. Something that couldn't be taken from me. Eventually, when the cold started crawling under my skin, I dragged myself back to my car. My old Honda Civic parked at a sad motel off El Camino. The heater barely worked. The neon vacancy sign buzzed all night. I barely slept. The next morning, I woke up in that stale motel room, applying to every job I could find: barista, receptionist, warehouse stocking, anything that would keep me afloat. My fingers were numb. My mind a fog of panic. That's when my phone rang. Unknown number. Miss Elia Vance? A woman said, crisp, professional, with a faint East Coast accent. I'm Claudia O'Neill, calling on behalf of Madame Odora Street Clare. She would like to meet with you immediately. I laughed bitterly. Is this some kind of prank? Not at all, she said coolly. A car is waiting for you outside room 112. The line went dead. My heart lurched. A prank? A scam? I checked the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. 19 identical black BMWs 760s. Lined the cracked parking lot like a presidential motorcade. A line so perfectly arranged it looked choreographed. The back door of the center car swung open slowly. Not hurried. Not rushed. Expectant. Like I was the one they had been waiting for. My knees felt weak, but I forced them to move. I opened the motel door and stepped out into the morning light, still wearing the same jeans and hoodie from 2 days ago. The cold air bit into me. But the woman sitting inside the car? She took my breath in a completely different way. It was her. The woman from the bench. The woman I thought was homeless. The woman I gave my coat to. Except now. Her hair was slicked back in a flawless low bun. Her camel hair coat was cinched at the waist. Her heels were Louboutins. Her jewelry gleamed with quiet wealth. She looked nothing like the fragile, shivering stranger on that bench. Hello, Elia, she said warmly, as if she were greeting an old friend. Her voice was stronger now. Clear. Confident. I stepped in, stunned and speechless. The door shut with a soft thud. The partition rose. The convoy began to move. I had no idea where she was taking me. I only knew one thing. My life had just cracked open, and something enormous was about to come through. The convoy rolled through Atherton like it owned the streets, and judging by the silent way cars parted for us, maybe it did. Every house we passed looked like something out of an Architectural Digest special. Massive estates with iron gates, manicured gardens, security cameras that tracked us like trained hawks. But the car interior felt strangely warm. Not just temperature-wise, something else. Something I couldn't quite name. The woman beside me sat with her back perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap. Elegant, composed, almost regal. Yet, every once in a while, she glanced at me like she was checking to make sure I was real. After a few minutes, she finally spoke. My name is Odora Street Clare, she said in a calm, melodic voice. But most people simply call me Madam. Madam. The word had weight to it. History. Authority. I saw you last night, I said softly, my voice shaky. You looked like you were freezing to death. Are you okay? She turned her head, studying me carefully. You gave me your coat, she said. Even when you had nothing left. Even when your world had just collapsed. It was just a coat, I murmured, embarrassed. No, child, she said, voice firm. It was not just a coat. It was kindness freely given. And genuine kindness is the rarest currency of all. My cheeks heated, and I didn't know what to say. Compliments always made me uncomfortable, especially ones that felt too big for who I believed myself to be. The convoy slowed, and my breath caught as iron gates slowly swung open on either side of us. We pulled into a sprawling 1920s Tudor-style estate draped in early morning light. The property looked like something out of a movie. A fountain. A circular drive. Tall oak trees that looked older than time. We stopped in front of the grand entrance, and a team of staff waited outside as if choreographed. Men in black suits. Women in crisp uniforms. A butler with a silver tray. Not one person looked surprised to see me. As if I'd been expected. The door opened for Madame first. She didn't step out immediately. Instead, she placed a soft hand on my knee. Elia, she said gently. You are safe here. Safe. I hadn't felt safe since before my father amended the trust. I followed her out of the car. The cold nipped at my skin, but the estate radiated something warm, something protective. The staff didn't stare. They didn't judge my wrinkled hoodie or messy hair. They simply nodded respectfully and waited. Claudia, her assistant from the phone call, approached with perfect poise. Madame St. Clair's study is prepared, she said. Coffee or tea for Miss Vance? I blinked. A coffee, I stammered. Please. Claudia nodded once, turned, and vanished inside with swift efficiency. Madame led me through the towering double doors. Inside was a cathedral of a foyer, dark oak beams, polished floors, a sweeping staircase with an iron banister that looked imported from Europe. The air smelled like jasmine and old books. And warmth. So much warmth. I realized how cold I still was when my fingertips started to tingle painfully as they thawed. Madame glanced back at me, reading everything in my face. Come, she said softly. Let us talk. We walked into a study filled with antique furniture, walls lined with books, windows draped with velvet curtains. A fire crackled warmly in the massive hearth. Madame motioned for me to sit on a plush, deep blue chaise lounge. She sat across from me in a carved wooden chair, posture flawless. Claudia brought my coffee with a small dish of lemon cookies, placed them silently on the table, and disappeared again. For a moment, Madame said nothing. She simply observed me, her eyes sharp but gentle. Finally, she spoke. I know what your family did, she said. The coffee cup nearly slipped from my fingers. How? How do you know anything about that? Madame folded her hands. Because I have been watching your family for a long time. My heartbeat tripped. Watching? Why? How? She didn't give me a chance to interrupt. Your parents are not simply wealthy, Elia, she continued. They are connected in circles where wealth is used as a weapon, where alliances are currency, where betrayal is not a possibility, but an expectation. Her words slid under my skin like ice. My father isn't like that, I protested weakly. He just made a choice. A cruel one, but a calculated one, Madame corrected gently. Not a mistake. Not a moment of emotion. A decision. Hearing it out loud felt like being punched. A decision to cast you aside because your sister offered him something he valued. She leaned forward. Control. I swallowed hard. Control. Vivica always wanted to be the center. The crown jewel. The favorite. She manipulated, charmed, and twisted things until she got what she wanted. And my parents let her. But why? I whispered. Why would they do that to me? Madame's expression softened. Because you were harder to manipulate. Because you asked questions. Because you had your own light, one your sister could not compete with. People like your parents, Elia, they reward obedience, not integrity. Tears stung my eyes again, hot and humiliating. I didn't want to cry in a mansion belonging to a stranger who wasn't really a stranger, but also kind of still a stranger. I wiped my face quickly. I don't understand, I whispered. Why are you helping me? Madame stood slowly and walked to her mahogany desk. She opened a drawer, pulled out a leather-bound folder, and placed it gently on the table between us. I am helping you, she said softly, because you helped me when you had nothing, and because your kindness revealed something your parents could never see. She placed a hand over the folder. Elia, your life is not collapsing. It is redirecting. My breath hitched as she slid the folder toward me. Inside, I could see documents. Letters. Contracts. Legal seals. Something enormous. Something life-altering. But I didn't open it yet. My fingers hovered. What's in this? I asked, barely breathing. Madame smiled, warm, proud, tinged with something almost maternal. A prophecy, she said. And a beginning. My fingers trembled as they hovered over the leather-bound folder. It felt bizarre, like a single object shouldn't be allowed to hold that much tension. That much potential. Madame waited. Still, silent, composed. She wasn't pushing me. She wasn't urging or hinting. She was simply present. I finally opened the folder. The first page wasn't legal paperwork like I expected. It was a photograph. A black and white portrait of a woman with poised eyes, hair swept back into a loose chignon, elegant posture, and a faint smile that somehow felt familiar. My brows furrowed. She looks like... I didn't finish the sentence. She looked like me. Not identically, but the resemblance was eerie. The slant of the eyes. The curve of the jaw. Even the way she seemed to be studying the camera, as if she already knew whoever saw this photo would be changed by it. Who is she? I whispered. Madame's eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen yet. Her name, she said gently, was Serafina Vance. Vance. My spine straightened so quickly it cracked. She was. Yes, Madame murmured. Your grandmother. But that wasn't what shocked me. What shocked me was the next sentence. And she was my sister. My heartbeat choked itself. Sister. Grandmother. Her sister. You knew my grandmother? I whispered, voice trembling. Knew her? Madam repeated softly. I loved her. She was the other half of my soul. She walked closer and took the photograph gently from my hands, her fingers brushing the edge of the worn paper. She disappeared before you were born, Madam continued. Your father told the world she died quietly, peacefully, after a long illness. My stomach tightened. I always thought that story felt off, I murmured. But he never talked about her. Because the truth, Madam said quietly, was not convenient for him. I pressed a hand to my mouth. What truth? I whispered. Madam's jaw clenched. For the first time, I saw a flash of raw emotion beneath her polished composure, anger sharpened by grief. Your grandmother, she said, was heir to something your father could never control. Something older than wealth. Older than the family name. She turned back to the desk and pulled out the next document. Old parchment sealed with a crimson wax crest I had never seen before. A crest of a phoenix rising through a wreath of thorns. Elia, she said softly, your grandmother belonged to a lineage known as the Sanctum Aves. The name felt ancient and powerful, like a whisper from the bones of the earth itself. What is that? I breathed. Madam stepped closer, lowering herself onto the seat across from me again. The Sanctum Aves is an order, she explained. Not of royalty or nobility, but of guardians. Thinkers. Strategists. Women who shaped nations in silence. Women who were never meant to be controlled by the systems men built. I swallowed. And my grandmother? She was one of its last sovereign leaders. My pulse thundered in my ears. And you? I whispered. A small smile touched her lips. I am the last surviving sovereign of the order. Her eyes locked onto mine. Until now. My breath caught. Wait, no. I'm not. I shook my head. I'm not like her. I'm not strong. I'm not trained. I'm not. Elia, Madam interrupted softly. You don't see yourself clearly yet. But I do. Her voice deepened with quiet conviction. You showed compassion without expectation. You survived abandonment without losing your softness. You faced betrayal without becoming bitter. These traits, she said, tapping the crest on the parchment, are the pillars of the Sanctum Aves. I stared at the crest. Phoenix. Thorns. Rebirth through pain. My throat tightened. But what does this have to do with my family? I whispered. Madam exhaled slowly, her gaze growing heavier. Your father, she said carefully, did not want the legacy to pass to someone he could not shape. Someone with a will of her own. Someone who reminded him too much of Serafina. The air went cold. He tried to erase every piece of your grandmother's influence, Madam continued. And when he realized he could not change who you were becoming. She paused. He cut you out. My nails dug into my palms. So all of this, disowning me, handing everything to Vivica, was because I wouldn't be his puppet? I whispered. Madam nodded once. And because he knew that if you awakened to your true inheritance, he would lose every ounce of control he ever wielded. I clenched my jaw. Anger stirred. Not wild and frantic like before. This anger was quiet. Focused. Precise. What inheritance? I asked. Madam opened the last section of the folder. Inside were 2 letters, handwritten, ink slightly faded. Both sealed in wax. Both addressed to the same person. Elia. My name. Written long before I existed. I reached for them slowly, fingers brushing the delicate paper. These were written by Serafina, Madam said. The first when she realized she was being pushed out of the family. The second, shortly before she vanished. I swallowed hard. Vanish? You mean she didn't die? Madam's eyes darkened. No, she didn't die. A pause. She was taken. The room tilted for a second. Taken? By who? Madam's voice turned quiet, deadly calm. By the same forces your father still serves. A chill slid down my spine. And suddenly, the world felt much bigger than betrayal. Much darker. Much more dangerous. I held the letters close to my chest. Madam, I whispered. What do you want from me? She approached me slowly. I want nothing, she said gently. But I offer you everything. She knelt in front of me, not as a queen before a subject, but as a guardian before an heir. Elia Vance, she whispered. You are the last rightful heir of the Sanctum Aves. And if you choose to accept your grandmother's legacy, everything your family tried to destroy will be rebuilt. I stared at her, chest tight, breath unsteady, heart racing. And if I don't accept? I asked softly. Madam smiled sadly. Then you will walk back into a world that already decided you were disposable. My fingers tightened around the letters. My heart knew the answer before my lips did. Silence settled between us, thick, pulsing, alive. I held Serafina's letters against my chest as if they could steady my heartbeat. Madame remained kneeling in front of me, her posture immaculate even in humility. The fire crackled in the background, casting flickering light across her face. Shadows stretched long and soft across the study, as if the entire house was holding its breath with me. "Elia," Madame murmured, "whatever choice you make, I will honor it. But I need you to understand. You are standing at the same crossroads your grandmother once faced." Her words wrapped around me like an incantation. "What happened to her?" I whispered. Madame didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose slowly and walked toward the tall window overlooking the estate grounds. Outside, dawn had fully broken, painting the gardens gold, illuminating frost on the branches, turning the fountain into a shimmering sculpture. "She was betrayed," Madame finally said. "By her own blood." My throat closed. "By my father?" Madame turned her head toward me. Her eyes held centuries of grief and unspoken fury. "Your father was young then," she said softly, "but old enough to understand ambition. Old enough to crave power he believed belonged to him. Serafina chose you, her future granddaughter, as heir long before you were born." I stared down at the letters. "Why me?" I whispered. Madame smiled sadly. "Because you were the firstborn female of her direct line. The sanctum avis doesn't pass through wealth. It passes through intuition, through spirit, through the ability to see truth where others see convenience." She approached me again and rested a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Your father feared that destiny," she continued. "Feared what it would make of you. Feared what it would reveal of him." My stomach twisted. "So, he cut me out to protect himself." "No, child," Madame corrected softly. "He cut you out to erase you." The words hit like cold water. Erase me. Not punish me. Not redirect me. Erase me. I felt something hot and sharp bloom deep in my chest, a fire I didn't know I had. "So what happens if I accept?" I asked. Madame studied me closely, her gaze deep enough to see marrow. "If you accept," she said, "you will inherit your grandmother's mantle. You will gain protection, allies, influence beyond your family's imagination, rooted not in cold money, but in legacy, in strategy, in ancient power that cannot be bought." She paused. "And you will also inherit her enemies." A chill slipped down my spine. "But you will not face them alone," Madame said. "You will have me, and others who have been waiting for the rightful heir to rise." The study felt smaller then, intimate, sacred. "Show me," I said quietly, "what it means." Madame inclined her head, almost like a bow. "Stand," she said. I rose, uncertain but resolute. Madame led me to a large bookcase along the far wall. She pressed her fingers along the spines until one clicked softly, a hidden latch. The entire bookshelf shifted. Behind it was a narrow doorway leading down a dimly lit staircase. My pulse quickened. Madame lit an ornate lantern from a side table and motioned for me to follow. We descended slowly, footsteps echoing off old stone. The air changed as we moved deeper, cooler, denser, yet strangely soothing. I could smell something faintly floral, like lavender and sage. The staircase opened into a vast chamber beneath the estate. And I froze. It was like stepping into a forgotten cathedral carved from the earth itself. Vaulted ceilings, stone archways, ancient symbols etched into the walls. At the center of the chamber stood a circular platform decorated with the same phoenix and thorns crest from the letter. This place wasn't modern wealth. It was history, power, something older than the family name I had been exiled from. Madame stepped onto the platform with practiced grace. "This is the sanctum," she said softly. "The heart of our order. Your grandmother once stood here, as will you if you choose." I approached slowly, prickling my skin. "What happened to everyone else?" I asked quietly. Madame closed her eyes for a moment. "What always happens," she whispered. "The world changed. The order slept. Only those strong enough to withstand betrayal survived." A heavy truth lay beneath her words. "And now?" I asked. She turned to me. "Now it wakes." I stepped onto the platform beside her. The stone beneath my feet felt warm, almost alive, like it recognized my presence. "Elia," she said, voice echoing softly in the chamber, "I will ask you only once." She faced me fully, lantern light glowing around her like an aura. "Do you accept your inheritance?" Her voice reverberated through stone and air. Do you accept the mantle your grandmother left for you? My heart pounded. Tears threatened. My life, what it had been 24 hours ago, felt impossibly small compared to the weight of this moment. I thought of my father's cold eyes, Vivica's triumphant smirk, the lawyers whispering behind glass, the humiliation, the abandonment, the night I spent shivering on the sidewalk while the woman in front of me froze alone under the rain. I took a deep breath. I accept, I whispered. Madame's eyes glimmered with something fierce and bright. Then kneel. I did. She placed her hand atop my head. Not heavy, not forceful, but steady. Elia Serafina Vance, she intoned, using a name I'd never been called before. By the blood of your grandmother and the spirit you alone possess, I recognize you as heir of the Sanctum Aves. The crest beneath us pulsed faintly with amber light. It felt like the earth was exhaling around me. Madame's voice softened but did not waver. Rise, Phoenix child. Your ashes are behind you. I lifted my gaze, breath trembling. And your vengeance, Madame whispered, has only just begun. The air in the sanctum shifted the moment Madame lifted her hand from my head. It wasn't dramatic, no earthquakes, no blinding light, but the atmosphere thickened, warm and humming, as if the chamber itself acknowledged the oath I had just spoken. The faint amber glow beneath the platform pulsed once more before fading into stillness. Madame watched me rise, and there was something new in her expression, something reverent, something fierce. You did not tremble, she murmured. I'm still trembling on the inside, I admitted softly. And yet, she said with a faint smile, you didn't run. There was pride in her voice. The first genuine, untainted pride I had ever felt from any adult in my life. She motioned for me to follow her deeper into the chamber, past the platform, and toward an alcove carved into the stone wall. Inside the alcove sat a chest, dark wood, reinforced with bronze, its edges adorned with the same phoenix crest. Madame knelt and pressed her palm onto the lid. A soft click echoed through the chamber. The chest unlocked. This, she said, lifting the lid slowly, was Serafina's. My breath caught when I saw what lay inside. Not jewels. Not money. Not gold bars or bonds, or anything my family would value. The chest held a leather journal, edges worn and stained. A thin dagger with a curved handle etched in silver. An old key on a chain. A ring inset with a single obsidian stone. A folded silk sash embroidered with the phoenix crest in gold thread. Madame reached in and gently lifted the journal first. She wrote this for you, she said quietly. My heart stopped for a moment. For me? Madame nodded. She knew you were coming long before any of us could imagine how or when. The Sanctum's line is not guided by logic or chance but intuition. And her intuition was sharper than any I have known. She pressed the journal into my hands. It was warm. Not warm like freshly held. Warm like it had been waiting. My throat tightened. Will it tell me what happened to her? I asked, voice barely audible. It will tell you what she wished for you to know, Madame answered, and what she hoped you would become. But the truth of her disappearance, that lies elsewhere. The dagger gleamed faintly beside the remaining items. I glanced at it, uneasy. Madame caught the look. It was ceremonial, she reassured gently. A symbol of protection. Not violence. I believed her. But still, holding it would feel like acknowledging a different kind of inheritance. She lifted the key next. This, she said, opens the last room Serafina used before she vanished. A room your father sealed and forbade anyone to enter. My breath hitched. Why? Madame's gaze darkened. Because whatever she left inside terrified him. A chill danced along my spine. She set the key in my palm. The chain was cool, almost icy. And the ring, she said, picking it up last, was hers. It will recognize you. Recognize me? I echoed. Put it on, Madame instructed. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then slipped the ring onto my finger. The metal tightened, not painfully, but like moldable warmth adjusting perfectly to my shape. The obsidian stone flickered with a faint shimmer. Madame smiled with quiet satisfaction. It fits, she said. Good. What does it mean? I asked. That you have accepted your place, she answered. The ring binds you to the sanctum, and the sanctum to you. I exhaled slowly, overwhelmed but strangely steady. And the sash? I asked, touching the gold-threaded phoenix lightly. It's worn only during formal gatherings, Madame said. Ceremony. Recognition. A reminder of the lineage you carry. I stared at it for a long moment. It felt too heavy. Too important. I don't know if I'm ready for all this, I whispered. Madame closed the chest carefully. No one ever is, she said. Not even Serafina. But readiness is not required, willingness is. She turned to face me fully. And you, Elia, are willing. That is more than enough. A quiet moment passed. Then the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell. I stiffened. Madame lifted her chin slightly, listening. A man appeared at the base of the stairs, tall, immaculately dressed in a dark suit, with sharp, symmetrical features and silver at his temples. His presence radiated old-world authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. He bowed to Madame first, deeply. Madame Street Claire. Then he turned to me, and bowed again. Lady Elia. My breath faltered. Lady. No one had ever called me that. Not even when my parents still pretended to love me. Gabriel, Madame said, you may rise. Gabriel straightened and addressed me directly, his tone respectful. We have secured the first layer of protection around the estate, he reported. Your father's legal team attempted to access your medical records this morning. We intercepted the request. Ice shot through my veins. My medical records? Why? Madame exchanged a look with Gabriel, a look that held anger, but also something sharper. Elia, Madame said gently, your father is not finished with you. The chamber felt suddenly smaller. Gabriel continued, voice steady but grave. We believe he intends to declare you mentally unfit in order to preempt any challenge you might bring. My jaw clenched. That's impossible, I said. I've never even. Logic does not matter, Madame interrupted. Appearance does. Influence does. Your father still holds both. Anger crackled through my chest. So he casts me out, I whispered. Erases me. And now he wants to destroy my credibility too. Gabriel bowed his head slightly. He underestimated how quickly you would find allies. Madame rested a hand on my shoulder. He underestimated who you truly are. I swallowed hard. What do we do now? I asked. Madame smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. Now, Phoenix Child, she said, we begin planning. Her eyes gleamed with quiet fire. And the first step, she whispered, is to reclaim what was stolen from you. The moment Madame said reclaim what was stolen from you, something sharp and electric ignited in my chest. Not rage. Not grief. Focus. For the first time since that front door slammed behind me on Christmas Eve, I felt the faint outline of a path forming. One leading back, but not as the discarded daughter. Not as the one they ridiculed, disinherited, and erased. But as someone they could no longer control. Madame turned toward the steps. Come. There is much to discuss, and we cannot do it here. Gabriel, prepare the East study. Gabriel bowed once. At once, Madame. He disappeared up the stairs with swift, precise movements. I followed Madame through the sanctum chamber, the soft click of her heels echoing off stone. As we reached the stairs, she paused and glanced down at my hands, the ring, the key, the journal. Do you feel it yet? She asked. Feel what? I murmured. A shift. Small but certain. The moment a story stops happening to you and begins happening because of you. I hesitated, and then nodded. Yes. I felt it. We ascended into a long hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling bookcases, filled with volumes older than anything my parents ever pretended to understand. Heavy portraits of previous sanctum heads watched from gilded frames. Stern men and poised women with eyes that seemed to follow my every step. Oddly, I didn't feel judged. Only studied. Measured. As though they were deciding whether I belonged. Madame led me into the East study, a spacious room wrapped in deep mahogany and warm lamplight. A fire crackled in the marble hearth. Gabriel had already arranged tea, documents, and a digital tablet on the long oak table. He turned the screen toward me. This, he said, tapping the display, is your father's attorney. A man who bends the law the way most people bend paper. Leonard Dorsey, ruthless, discreet, and loyal only to those with deep pockets. A photo appeared, late 50s, slick smile, shark eyes. He filed 2 sealed motions this morning. One aims to freeze any account in your name, including those with a positive balance. Gabriel swiped the screen again. The other seeks to obtain psychological evaluations dated over the last 10 years. My gut tightened. I've never undergone any psychological evaluations, I said. That, Gabriel replied, will not stop them from fabricating one. Madame poured tea with calm precision, as if we were discussing nothing more dramatic than a dinner menu. Your father, she said, is attempting a long-game erasure. Financially, emotionally, reputationally. He wants the world to see you as unstable, so that your disinheritance appears benevolent rather than cruel. My stomach burned. So people believe he's saving me from myself, I muttered bitterly. Madam nodded. Yes, a very old tactic among men who fear a woman's truth more than their own lies. I tightened my grip around the journal. What's the plan? I asked. Madam exchanged a brief, knowing look with Gabriel. He stepped back, allowing her to speak first. Elia, she said slowly, the sanctum does not interfere in petty family squabbles. We do not involve ourselves in inheritance disputes or internal dramas. A hollow throb opened in my chest. So you won't help me, I whispered. Madam lifted her hand to silence me. We do not involve ourselves, she continued, in petty problems. But what your father is attempting is not petty. She walked around the table and stood directly in front of me. It is systemic, intentional, and deeply dangerous. Her gaze sharpened. And that falls squarely within our domain. The breath I didn't realize I was holding rushed out of me. Then what do I do? I asked, voice steadier now. Madam clasped her hands behind her back. 3 things, she said. Prepare, observe, and reclaim. She gestured for me to sit at the table. First, she continued, we gather information. Gabriel, show her. Gabriel nodded and produced a thin black folder. He opened it, revealing pages of surveillance stills, financial reports, and handwritten notes. This, he said, is everything we have on your father's dealings over the last 8 months. I blinked in shock. You've been following him? For years, Madam corrected. Serafina requested we watch the Vance family, though she never explained why. My mouth went dry. What did she know? I whispered. Madam's eyes softened, but for the first time, I sensed something else beneath that softness. Fear. She suspected, Madam said slowly, that your father was involved in something darker than business restructuring and high society posturing. My pulse thudded hard. Darker, how? Madam didn't answer. Instead, she motioned for Gabriel. He clicked another image onto the tablet. My father, standing in an underground parking structure beside 2 men. One in a charcoal suit with a serpent tattoo curling up his neck. One with scars across his knuckles, holding a briefcase. The timestamp was from 4 months ago. What is this? I asked, voice barely audible. Gabriel replied quietly. Your father meets with them often. Usually after midnight. Never at his office, never on record. My throat tightened. Is he in trouble? Madam set a hand gently on my shoulder. Elia, she said gently, your father has built a life on status and appearances. But underneath, he is rotting, and men who are rotting become unpredictable. I felt numb. So his attack on me was not personal, Madam said, though it feels personal. His behavior is driven by fear. You are a liability to whatever he's hiding. Gabriel closed the folder. That means, he said, you must become unpredictable as well. Silence settled over the room, heavy but electric. Madam's voice shifted into something calm and lethal. We will begin with reclaiming your narrative, your reputation, your voice. I frowned. My voice. Madam nodded. We will not strike him yet, she said. That comes later. First, we build you so high that even his lies cannot reach you. The fire cracked behind us like a whispered warning. She leaned in slightly. You will let your father believe he has won. A chill ran down my arms. And then, she whispered, you will show him what a phoenix really is. I swallowed hard. What do I have to do? Gabriel answered this time, his tone all business. Step 1, we take you back to the house. My whole body froze. No, I breathed. I can't go back there. Not after what they did. Madam lifted my chin gently. You will not go back as the daughter they discarded. Her eyes hardened with fire. You will go back as the heir they never saw coming. The storm finally broke just after dawn. For hours the sky had been trembling with a pressure no one could name, a tension that made even the bravest uncertain. But when the first crack of light split the clouds, everything changed, subtly at first, and then all at once. They gathered outside the old structure, its walls still humming with the faint aftershock of what had happened in the night. No one spoke. They were all waiting for the same thing. Answers. Or at least a sign. It was Aaron who stepped forward first. His expression was no longer fear, but something more complicated. Resolve mixed with a realization he hadn't wanted. It reacted to the signal, he said quietly. Not by accident. It recognized it. The others exchanged glances. Even those who had doubted him before were silent now. Lyra, who had been the most skeptical of all, lowered her voice so that only the group could hear. Then the timeline is shifting faster than we calculated. A shiver moved through the circle. The artifact, if it could still be called that, now pulsed with a rhythm that seemed disturbingly alive. Not chaotic, but purposeful. Every pulse felt like a countdown, though none of them knew to what. They moved closer. As the light from the device brightened, new markings began to surface across its metallic frame. Symbols none of them recognized, yet each felt eerily familiar. Almost as if they had seen them somewhere before, in dreams or memories too old to be trusted. Aaron inhaled sharply. We have to decide now, before it completes whatever it's doing. Lyra nodded. Then part 8 begins with a choice. She placed her hand on the cool surface, and the glow intensified, reacting to her touch as if it had been waiting specifically for her. A smooth vibration moved through the ground beneath them. A sound followed. A message. A warning. Or perhaps an invitation. No one could tell. But one thing was clear. Whatever waited beyond this moment would change everything again. The morning air was sharp, a knife edge of cold that sliced through my cashmere coat like it wanted to remind me I was still alive, still vulnerable, still human. But inside, something was no longer broken. Something inside me had snapped, not in surrender, but in recognition of my own fire. Madame St. Clair's words echoed as I walked silently through the cobblestone courtyard of the Vance estate. You will go back as the heir they never saw coming. I had rehearsed that moment in my mind countless times, every scene meticulously played. Walking through the front doors, unshaken, composed, radiating an authority I had never allowed myself to claim. Every gesture, every glance, every measured step would announce to my parents that I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was a storm wrapped in silk and fire. Gabriel, always precise, had arranged for a vehicle to meet me at the outer gates. A black BMW, its polished frame reflecting the pale morning sun. I approached silently, the keys to the Vance estate's inner systems tucked in my coat pocket. The driver, an older man with a hawk's gaze, barely nodded as I entered the back seat. The quiet hum of the engine matched the rhythm of my pulse, slow, steady, deliberate. You're ready, he said simply. I didn't need to respond. My jaw was set. My hands were steady. Ready. The gates of the estate loomed in the distance, tall and gilded, almost mocking in their grandeur. Every inch of the property spoke of opulence, a fortress built to protect wealth and status, but also a cage. I had once been a prisoner within those walls, suffocated by expectation and comparison. Today, they would see me differently. As the car slowed at the entryway, I caught sight of my father, Langston, pacing near the fountain, his expression carefully controlled, yet betraying a faint tremor. Not fear, he had never known fear, but irritation, a crack in the mask of dominance he wore so effortlessly. And there was Viva, my sister, radiant in a red dress that screamed privilege and arrogance. Darius lingered behind her, perfectly poised, exuding smug confidence. They were the trio that had orchestrated my erasure with casual cruelty, and now, unknowingly, they were about to witness the beginning of their undoing. The car stopped. The driver opened the door, and I stepped out, letting the cold air wrap around me. Not to intimidate, but to remind myself of the nights I had endured. Nights spent shivering on park benches. Nights when I had given away the only coat I owned to a stranger who would later change the course of my life. I walked slowly across the marble driveway. Each step was deliberate, calculated, not just for appearance, but for the psychological weight of presence. By the time I reached the front doors, the murmurs had begun. Staff peered from behind curtains. My father's eyes narrowed. Viva's smile faltered slightly. Darius blinked too slowly. I stopped just inside the doorway, letting the cold marble floor greet me. "Merry Christmas," I said, my voice even calm, but laced with an authority that made their laughter from last year feel like the distant echo of a storm now past. They froze. "You're back," Viva whispered, her voice higher than usual, unsteady. "Yes," I replied. "Back." And with more than just words this time. Langston straightened, adjusting his cufflinks as if that small gesture could reassert control over a situation he had misjudged. "Elia." His tone carried the weight of decades, but there was no warmth. Only calculation. We didn't expect you until tomorrow." I tilted my head slightly, letting a faint smile tug at the corner of my lips. "You expected me to be absent," I said. "And yet here I am." The air between us shifted. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. My presence had introduced a variable no one had considered. They had underestimated the fire that had grown in me, the network of allies, the preparation that had been months, maybe years, in the making. Madame St. Clair's lessons were already working. Each calculated step, each gesture, each measured pause was designed to destabilize them psychologically. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved the journal, the one Serafina had left me. I let it rest in my hands, letting the weight of its history and secrets speak without a word. Their eyes followed the movement, drawn inexplicably to it. "This belonged to someone," I said softly, letting the pause hang in the air, "who believed in the strength of legacy, in the courage to stand when everyone else casts you aside. I have spent the last months learning what it means to claim that strength." Viva's lips parted. Darius' jaw tightened. Even my father's carefully constructed mask showed the faintest cracks. I set the journal down on the table by the fountain, a symbolic placement, one that would be noticed and remembered by anyone who cared to look. Then I reached into my pocket again, producing the obsidian ring, slipping it onto my finger in full view of them. The reaction was immediate. A shift in the room, a subtle contraction in the muscles of my father's face, an almost imperceptible recoil from Viva. They didn't understand it, couldn't understand it, but they felt it. Power. Authority. Presence. "From this moment forward," I said, voice ringing clear through the foyer, "I am no longer the daughter you discarded. I am the heir, the one who will define her own legacy. Every move you make to diminish me from here on out will fail, and every attempt to mock, control, or erase me will only illuminate your fear." Langston's eyes narrowed, the first real expression of emotion since the door slammed that fateful Christmas Eve. "You speak boldly," he said. "Do you truly understand the consequences?" I smiled faintly, allowing a hint of my old bitterness to surface, carefully measured. "I do. And that is why I am unafraid." The subtle shifting of allegiances began almost immediately. Staff who had once glanced at me with pity now looked with curiosity, respect even. Subtle nods exchanged in the hallway, whispers that traveled quickly. Wordless acknowledgement that the woman standing before them was not the same one who had left on that icy Christmas Eve. Gabriel emerged quietly from the shadows, unseen by my family, but I knew he was there. The presence of allies always matters. And Madame St. Clair's influence stretched far beyond her estate. Every move I made was guided, shielded, and reinforced by a network invisible to my father, but palpable in its effects. I walked past the fountain, each step deliberate. By the time I reached the staircase to the second floor, where the family's private chambers lay, the psychological impact had begun. Eyes followed my movement. Hearts raced subtly. The family hierarchy had shifted before anyone had realized it. And that, I knew, was only the beginning. The second floor smelled of polished wood and faint perfume, Mama's scent lingering like a ghost. Each room I passed was a shrine to the lives my family thought they controlled, their meticulously curated perfection a silent mockery of the chaos they had inflicted on me. I didn't pause. Every step was deliberate, a rhythm designed to make my presence felt. The echoes of my boots on the hardwood were amplified in the grand hallway, each click a subtle reminder. I had returned, and nothing would be the same. In the master suite, the first confrontation awaited. Langston was there, pacing slowly near the window, the morning light falling across his sharp features. He didn't turn immediately when I entered, but I felt the change in the air, every fiber of his being aware of my presence. "Sit," he commanded, his tone clipped but betraying tension. I didn't sit. Instead, I stepped closer, letting the polished floor reflect my resolve back to him. "No," I said, calm, unwavering. "You've asked me to stand on my own 2 feet for months. Today, I stand fully in my own power. Not as your daughter to command, but as a force you underestimated." His jaw tightened. "Elia, you're overstepping." "Overstepping?" I interrupted, my voice sharp yet controlled. "You legally erased me. Threw me out. Mocked me publicly. I am reclaiming what you thought you could destroy. I am overstepping your illusion of control." For the first time, I saw genuine uncertainty flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. The man who had once dictated every move I made was suddenly trying to assess the woman standing before him. Viva appeared in the doorway, her red silk gown a stark contrast to my muted, purposeful attire. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Elia," she began, but I didn't wait. "You don't get to speak first," I said, pacing slowly across the room. "You've spent your life deciding whose story matters. Today, mine begins. And every step I take will remind you. You didn't win. You just delayed the inevitable." Darius lingered behind her, arms crossed, silent but watchful. He had been a constant in my past, a reminder of love lost, betrayal endured. I allowed a flicker of memory to pass. Our breakup, the smug smirk, the words that had cut deep. But now I felt nothing but focus. I imagine you've been wondering, I continued, turning to face the trio fully, how a woman you thought broken can stand taller than ever. Let me show you the answer. With that, I reached into my coat pocket and produced a small, sleek tablet, the kind that could display anything, anywhere. I tapped it once, and the screen flickered to life, revealing a series of documents, video clips, and financial records meticulously gathered over the past months. Evidence of every scheme, every slight, every attempt to erase me, I said softly, letting the weight of the words settle. You thought you controlled the narrative, but now it controls you. Langston's hand twitched slightly toward the side of the desk. I ignored it. The family trust you amended? Reversible. Not by brute force, not by luck, but by law, strategy, and alliances you underestimated. Every accountant, every lawyer, every insider you relied on has been quietly briefed. Every move you make from here on will be observed and countered. Viva's lips parted, panic threatening her usual composure. Ilya, you can't. I already have, I said, my tone low, deliberate. And you'll understand fully when you see the implications unfold. Darius finally spoke, his voice tight. You've planned all this? Yes, I said simply. Every step, every misstep you made, every humiliation you thought would break me, has been catalogued, anticipated, and leveraged. I am not the same person you discarded. I am the one you will never predict, and you're about to see why. The room fell into heavy silence. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting for the first crack in the walls my family had built. And there it was, Langston's subtle shift in stance, the tightening of Viva's fingers, the hesitation in Darius' gaze. I stepped closer to the window, letting the morning light catch the edge of the tablet screen. You will all remember this day, I said softly, yet every word struck with precision. Not as the day you disinherited your daughter, but as the day she became unstoppable. I could feel it, the subtle psychological impact, the recalibration of power. The staff in the hallways, still peeking through doors, recognized it instantly. Even the estate itself, vast and imposing, felt smaller under the force of my presence. I didn't stop there. With deliberate slowness, I activated a second screen, projecting a series of emails and contracts. Your manipulation, your secret dealings, your favoritism, it's all here, I said. Every backhanded move, every calculated slight, every betrayal documented. And you will have to face it. Langston's expression shifted fully now, anger edged with panic. This is. I know, I interrupted, holding his gaze. It's everything you didn't want me to have. Everything you thought was buried. And now it's visible, undeniable, and irreversible. You will not control me anymore. Not with money, not with status, not with fear. You can try, but you will fail. And when you do, you'll finally understand the consequences of underestimating someone you threw away. Viva's face twisted with disbelief. She opened her mouth again, but no words came. Darius shifted uncomfortably. Even Langston faltered, caught between outrage and the stark reality. I had changed the game entirely. I took a step back, letting my presence fill the room completely. The morning sun caught the edge of the tablet, glinting like a warning light. This, I said, my voice calm, resolute, is only the beginning. Every step you took to diminish me has been catalogued, countered, and prepared against. And now, you'll witness the first layer of consequences, executed with precision, intelligence, and inevitability. Silence filled the room again. But this time, it was heavy with tension, anticipation, and dread. Not for me, but for them. I had reclaimed the first piece of my power. And already, I could see the cracks widening in the facade they had built so meticulously over decades. The story was no longer theirs to control. And that realization, their sudden, visceral understanding of it, was intoxicating. The hours that followed were a delicate dance of observation, patience, and precision. I didn't speak unless necessary, but every movement I made was deliberate, every glance calculated to unsettle. Langston paced the room, muttering under his breath, a habit he hadn't lost despite years of controlling every situation. I let him stew, letting the silence press against him like an invisible weight. Viva hovered near the doorway, her red gown now seeming almost garish, a stark contrast to her growing unease. Darius leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw tight, trying and failing to mask his apprehension. I sat, deliberately, on the edge of the master chair, letting the polished wood beneath me creak slightly. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in the charged silence, it resonated. A small signal, a reminder. I was here, and I wasn't leaving. Are you done with your theatrics? Langston finally spat, his voice sharp but cracking at the edges. I smiled faintly, a calm predator in a room full of cornered prey. This isn't theatrics, I said. This is reality. You built a life on the illusion of control. But reality, I paused, letting the word hang like a blade, cannot be fabricated, avoided, or stolen. Viva's lips quivered as she finally found words. You can't just undo everything. The estate, the trust, the family reputation, you can't. I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees, letting my voice drop an octave. Watch me. Then, in a calculated move, I activated the tablet. A file appeared, one I had reserved for this moment. A single document, meticulously prepared, detailing every decision, every mismanagement, every financial misstep that had been carefully hidden. I had gathered every shred of evidence, every ledger, every email, every contract. The document was devastatingly comprehensive. Langston's eyes widened. The carefully crafted composure he had relied upon for decades faltered. Viva's face went pale, her smirk replaced with something closer to horror. Darius, usually untouchable, shifted nervously. This, I said slowly, deliberately, is the first of many steps to reclaiming what you tried to destroy. I paused to let it sink in. Their pride, their carefully built empire of perception and power, was cracking, and they knew it. You how? Langston's voice wavered. How did you? I didn't just survive, I interrupted. I observed. I learned. I prepared. Every slight, every dismissal, every betrayal was catalogued, understood, and countered. Viva moved closer, trying to regain some semblance of control. You can't be serious. You're just a discarded daughter? I finished her sentence for her, letting the words hang in the air. Yes, that was my role in your story. But in mine, I am the author. I am the strategist. And I am in control. The tension in the room was palpable. Every tick of the grandfather clock seemed amplified, each second stretching longer than the last. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and they were beginning to feel it, not in words, but in the air between us, thick and electric. I rose slowly, letting my height and presence dominate the room. Do you remember Christmas Eve? I asked quietly, almost conversationally. When I stood on your marble steps, frozen, humiliated, discarded? I remember every second. And I also remember the lesson I learned from someone unexpected. That even when you have nothing, the choice to act with integrity and courage creates opportunities the cruelest people cannot imagine. Langston opened his mouth, but no words came. Viva's hands clenched at her sides. Darius finally let out a quiet, frustrated sigh. I took a step closer, letting my voice drop to a whisper that carried all the weight of the months of planning, the late nights, the meticulous plotting. You thought you could erase me, that I would crawl back begging, like some character in the story you wrote for me. But you underestimated me. You underestimated what I could endure, what I could build, and what I could unleash. The room fell silent again, heavier this time. Their disbelief was almost tangible. I moved to the window, drawing the curtains slightly to let the sunlight illuminate the documents on the tablet. This is only the beginning, I said. Every lie you told, every manipulation, every favor you assumed would keep me small. I have records. I have witnesses. I have leverage. And I have the patience to see it through. Langston's jaw tightened. He had underestimated the strategic patience I had cultivated. Viva's usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a fragile, fearful hesitation. Darius' confidence, the smug grin he had perfected over years, was faltering. And while you worry about what I can do, I said, lowering my voice, letting each word land like a hammer, I am already planning the steps that will ensure I am unassailable. Not because I seek revenge, not for petty satisfaction, but because the world will not ignore me, and neither will you. For the first time, they looked genuinely small, diminished, exposed. The empire of ego and privilege that had once loomed over me seemed fragile, brittle, like glass waiting to shatter under the right pressure. I leaned back slightly, letting the calm control of the room settle around me. Do you feel it? I asked softly. The shift? That's the moment you realize the game has changed. And the best part, you don't even know the rules yet. But I do. Viva's eyes welled with unshed tears. Langston's fingers drummed nervously on the desk. Darius swallowed hard. And in that moment, I felt the true weight of my own power. Not the inherited wealth, not the material possessions, but the clarity, the strategy, and the undeniable proof that I could rise above even the deepest betrayal. The room felt different now. Not because the walls had changed, not because the furniture had moved, but because I had changed the dynamic entirely. They were no longer the gatekeepers of my life. I was. And this was just the opening move. The silence after my final sentence stretched out so long it felt like its own presence in the room. Thick, heavy, suffocating. No one dared speak. Even the HVAC's low hum seemed to hush itself, as though the house were listening for what came next. Then, in a brittle voice that belonged more to a frightened man than the Titan of Hillsborough he pretended to be, Langston finally said, "What do you want?" The question landed with a dull thud. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Real. Raw. Desperate. I didn't answer right away. I let him sit in that fear. Because the old version of me, the obedient daughter, the overlooked achiever, the one who begged for scraps of affection, would have answered too quickly. Too kindly. Too predictably. But the woman standing in front of him now had learned the value of silence. I walked to the center of the room, heels whispering over polished wood. What do I want? I repeated softly, almost to myself. I want truth. Accountability. Restoration. My eyes narrowed. And respect. The kind you never offered me. Viva scoffed, a brittle, defensive sound. But it died halfway out of her throat when I turned my head toward her. One look. That was all it took. For the first time since the night they dragged me through hell, she looked unsure whether her usual weapon, mockery, would save her. Spoiler, it wouldn't. You cheated your way into my life, I said to her, voice leveling into a calm so cold it should have frosted the walls. You stole my relationship, my future, my financial inheritance, all because you couldn't stand that I existed in a world where you weren't automatically the chosen one. Her nostrils flared. You think you deserve that trust? That money? That position? You were always the unstable one, the one who... I lifted a hand, cutting her off with a gesture so slight it felt like a dismissal. Don't project your insecurities onto me. I didn't lose anything, you stole it. And now, it's time you understand that consequences aren't fictional. Darius shifted, arms uncrossing from his chest. Elia, listen. Oh, don't even start, I said, turning to him with a low, humorless laugh. You built your entire brand on integrity and innovation, on being a visionary entrepreneur. Meanwhile, your biggest vision was my sister's bedroom ceiling. The color drained from his face. His jaw clenched. He looked at the floor. Good. I moved closer, deliberately invading his personal space just enough to make him swallow hard. You want to know why investors trust you? Because they never saw the rot underneath. But now, I let my smile sharpen. Let's just say I have enough evidence to make even your most loyal backers reconsider their choices. Viva's breath hitched. Langston's brow knit in confusion. Darius looked like he'd been punched. I stepped back and raised the tablet. And no, this isn't blackmail. I don't need to leak anything. Not yet. I prefer my moves timed elegantly. Langston finally snapped. Elia, enough games. Tell me, what are you angling for? I looked at him then. Really looked. At the man who taught me discipline, strategy, and ruthlessness, yet believed I'd never learned to wield those lessons myself. What I angle for, I said, is proportional. You took something priceless, my dignity, my security, my identity. So I'll take something you value just as deeply. I walked toward the desk, each step steady, the confidence in my stride undeniable. I want 3 things. Not negotiable. Their shoulders tensed. Their breathing shifted. They were bracing for impact. First, I said, the trust amendment you filed is nullified. Irrevocable or not, the courts will eat it alive once they see the fraud. You will reinstate my inheritance, fully, with interest. Viva made a strangled noise. Darius looked away. Langston's eyes flickered, not to challenge me, but to calculate the damage. Second, I continued, I want a written and recorded admission of what you did to me on Christmas Eve. The world doesn't need to see it, unless you force my hand. But I will have it. Viva whispered, you're insane. And third, I said, turning to face them all, you will acknowledge, out loud on record, that I am not disposable. That I am not the failure you painted me as. That I am, and always have been, the daughter who actually built something with integrity. The room vibrated with tension. A pause sharpened the air. And then I added softly, and you will do it without resentment, because this isn't revenge. This is correction. The phrase hit Langston like a physical blow. His knees bent almost imperceptibly, the first visible crack in his fortress of pride. He sank into a leather chair he rarely used, rubbing his temples with shaking hands. You want to humiliate us, he whispered. I shook my head. No. Humiliation is a fleeting punishment. I want you to understand who I am. And I want the record to show you finally did. For a moment, just a moment, he looked like a man confronting the consequences of decades of arrogance. Finally, he exhaled. A long, broken sound. What happens if we refuse? I smile, softly, almost sympathetically. Oh, Dad, you won't refuse. I turned the tablet, revealing a single file. A single name. A single piece of leverage so explosive it made the blood drain from his face. You see, I whispered, I know your secret partner in the offshore accounts. The one Mama never knew about. The one whose involvement would end your career, your reputation, and your marriage. Langston's breath stilled. His eyes widened. His pulse visibly quickened. And that's when his voice broke. Ilya, what have you done? But a better question was, what had they done to create this version of me? For a moment, Langston looked less like the untouchable patriarch of the most powerful family in Hillsborough, and more like a man suddenly aware of his own mortality. Not physical mortality. Reputational mortality. Legacy mortality. The kind that eats egos alive. His voice, when it finally came, was low and strangled. Ilya, what have you done? I took one slow step toward him. Then another. Not threatening, measured. Composed. Deliberate. I didn't create the storm, I murmured. I simply learned how to read the weather reports. Viva stiffened. Darius swallowed. Langston's fingers tightened against the armrest, knuckles whitening as the implications of my words seeped into him like poison. Let's not pretend, I continued softly, circling the room as if walking through the perimeter of my own victory. Those offshore accounts didn't appear out of thin air, and certainly not with the involvement of someone as politically radioactive as your secret partner. He flinched. It was small, yes, subtle, but a flinch from a man who prided himself on emotional immobility was tectonic. Say the name, he whispered. I tilted my head, offering a serene smile. No, he blinked. No, he repeated, stunned. I shook my head slowly. There's no need. You know who it is. That's enough. Viva's eyes darted between us, confused but scared enough to stay quiet for once. Darius, ever the coward, stepped back as if the mere mention of this unnamed conspirator might implicate him too. Good. Let them tremble. Let the accountability sit heavy on their shoulders for a change. Langston swallowed, throat working visibly. Do you have proof? I raised the tablet slightly. Would I be here if I didn't? His eyes closed. Not in denial, but in surrender. That, right there, was the moment the power dynamic flipped permanently. When he opened them again, he looked older. More fragile. Less godlike. What do you want me to do? He murmured. I told you, I replied. 3 things. Reinstate my inheritance with interest, provide a written and recorded admission of what you did to me, and acknowledge that I was never the failure you made me out to be. And if I refuse, you won't. My voice was soft, but the softness wasn't mercy, it was certainty. Langston stared at me for a long, pained moment. Then he nodded. Just once. But acknowledgement from him, even a single nod, was a seismic event. Viva burst then, unable to hold herself together any longer. This is insane. You're blackmailing your own father. For what? Money? Validation? You're pathetic. I turned to her with a look so calm it made her stumble a step back. Viva, sweet sister. The only reason you call me pathetic is because you can't weaponize your usual tactics against me anymore. She barked a humorless laugh. You think this makes you strong? You think this makes you better than us? I don't need to be better than you, I said, tone almost pitying. I just need to be free of the lies that kept you comfortable. Her lips curled. If you expose all of this, you'll destroy the family name. That's the difference between you and me. I stepped closer, until we stood inches apart. I don't hide behind a name. I build one. Her breath caught. A flicker of something, panic, flashed in her eyes. Besides, I added more quietly, I never said I wanted to expose anything. I just want restoration. If you all sign the agreements I bring next week, then none of this sees daylight. Darius finally found his voice. Ilya, we can work something out privately. You don't have to involve. You mean you don't want your shareholders involved? I cut in. Or your board. Or that lovely investor you met last month. The one you forgot has a wife. The blood drained from his face. I watched the color disappear with clinical detachment. You've been busy, he whispered. You have no idea, I replied. Viva looked between us, horrified. You dug into all of us? No, I corrected. I dug into the parts of you that endangered me. If you had simply left me alone, I would have stayed quiet forever. Silence. Electric. Fractured. Langston, voice thin with defeat, finally said, Elia, I'll sign whatever you want. I'll reinstate everything. Just don't expose that partnership. Please. The word please slipped out, like blood from a wound. I let it hang in the air a moment, savoring the rarest sound in the world, my father begging. But I didn't gloat. Revenge wasn't the goal. Balance was. Good, I said softly. Because I don't want to destroy you, Dad. Not unless you force me to. He nodded again, slow, resigned, broken. Then quietly, will you give me the chance to make this right? I considered him, really considered him. The man who molded me into steel. The man who crushed me, thinking I'd stay shattered. The man who now looked at me with something dangerously close to respect. I'll give you one chance, I said. Just one. His shoulders sagged with relief. But the moment was far from over. Because Viva surged forward then, voice cracking with fury. You're ruining everything. You're twisting this. You're manipulating him. No, I said, turning to her with icy precision. I'm holding him accountable. Something you've never had the courage to do. I don't need courage, she spat. I have loyalty. I stared at her for a long, aching moment. Then I shook my head. No, Viva. You have dependency. You call it loyalty because the truth is too painful. She looked stunned. Hurt. Then furious again. I continued more quietly. You don't know who you'd be without Dad's approval. I do. And that's why you hate me. Her jaw trembled. She opened her mouth to argue. But Langston's voice cut through, weary and frail. Enough. And that single word ended the fight. Not because he commanded it, but because for the first time in our lives, I let him. The room felt almost sacred after Langston's single, weary command. Enough. Viva's fiery defiance had fizzled like a candle in the wind, leaving only the cold truth between us. Darius, still pale and stiff, hovered near the doorway, unable to intervene, as if the very air of accountability had rendered him powerless. And Langston slumped further into the leather chair, the weight of decades of hubris finally breaking down. I let the silence stretch. Let them feel the enormity of the shift. This wasn't just about money, or inheritance, or even humiliation. This was about reclaiming a narrative they had spent years controlling. About proving that I could survive, adapt, and rise on my own terms. I pulled the tablet closer, scrolling through the meticulously compiled evidence I had assembled over months. Every document, every email, every transaction, all meticulously catalogued. Each one a silent witness to the hypocrisy and deception that had been my inheritance. I want this signed, I said softly, placing the tablet on the desk. Not because I'm cruel, but because I'm entitled. Because I survived your betrayal. And because I will no longer be invisible in a room where power was once used to erase me. Langston exhaled, his voice trembling. You've become formidable. I underestimated you. I let a small smile cross my face. You weren't alone in that mistake. Viva looked ready to protest again, but I held up a hand. This isn't a fight. This is the beginning of accountability. And perhaps, if you're willing, redemption. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Darius shifted uneasily, clearly calculating, clearly recognizing that his usual charm and manipulation would not save him here. I leaned forward, tapping the tablet. Everything I've shown you, you know it's accurate. One wrong signature, one attempt to undermine me, and the consequences extend far beyond our family. It's time you faced the truth, and acted responsibly. Langston nodded slowly, defeated but resolute. I will sign. Every document. I will restore what was taken. And I will acknowledge you properly, in every sense. A shiver of satisfaction ran down my spine. It wasn't triumph yet, not fully, but it was the first tangible taste of it. You understand this is not about revenge, I continued, voice steady. Revenge is fleeting. This is about establishing boundaries, respect, and proof that what you tried to destroy cannot be destroyed. Viva's eyes darted between us, searching for cracks, looking for any weakness. There were none. I had become the embodiment of patience, strategy, and resilience. The woman they had tried to break now held the ultimate leverage, the moral, intellectual, and strategic high ground. Langston coughed, the first sign of vulnerability I had ever seen in him during moments of confrontation. You've changed, he said quietly. Not just smarter, but colder. Calculated. I leaned back, allowing the words to linger in the room. Cold is the language of justice when the heart has been burned by betrayal. Calculated is the only armor when everyone you trusted turns against you. Darius opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. Words would not serve him. Not here. Not now. Finally, I spoke again, my voice dropping to a near whisper, meant only for them. You wanted me gone, invisible, powerless. You failed. You left me with nothing, thinking that would be the end. But the truth is, when stripped of everything, you learn who you truly are. And who I truly am. Langston's hand trembled as he reached for a pen. Viva's face was a storm of disbelief and suppressed anger. Darius' usual composure was gone, his world, once so controlled, now unspooled before him. As Langston signed the first document, the atmosphere shifted subtly. It wasn't jubilation. Not yet. But it was the weight of justice settling into place. I watched carefully, savoring each stroke of ink. Each mark was not just a signature, it was validation. Proof that the woman they tried to discard could command authority over her own life. Proof that betrayal, no matter how deep, could be met with clarity and precision. Next, I said, guiding Langston through the remaining documents with methodical calm. My words were firm but measured, each step reinforcing the balance of power that had been so violently shifted. Viva's lips pressed into a thin line, but she remained silent. This wasn't over for her. I knew that. But for now, she had no leverage. No argument. And most importantly, no ability to make me doubt my position. As Langston finished the final signature, I let out a slow breath. The tension in the room remained, but it had changed character. It was no longer fear of the unknown. It was recognition. Respect. Even if grudging. I looked around the room, letting my eyes linger on each of them. Now, I said softly, you know exactly who I am. And you know what I am capable of. Let this be the foundation upon which we move forward, if you're willing to be honest and accountable. Langston nodded again, a shadow of relief crossing his features. Viva's gaze remained fixed on me, calculating, seething, but undeniably altered. Darius' jaw was tight, his mind racing, but the grip of his previous confidence was broken. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the powerless child standing on frozen marble steps. I felt sovereign. The documents, the strategy, the months of planning, they were all pieces of a puzzle that had finally fit together. I had not just survived betrayal. I had orchestrated the reckoning. And in doing so, I had reclaimed a part of myself that no one, not even family, could take away. I took a slow step back, letting the silence envelop us once more. This is only the beginning, I said quietly. But now, we begin on equal terms. And I intend to ensure that equality is respected. Langston finally exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Viva's fingers flexed at her sides, her anger simmering but constrained. Darius shifted once more, his eyes betraying a mix of fear and grudging acknowledgement. I allowed myself a small, private smile. Victory didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to be destructive. It simply had to be complete. And in that moment, as the signatures dried and the weight of accountability settled, I realized something profound. The woman who had been discarded, humiliated, and betrayed was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and fully untouchable. The air felt heavier after the last signature. It wasn't oppressive. It was anticipatory, like the calm before a storm finally allowed to break. The weight of months of scheming, planning, and silent observation now manifested in the most potent way. Control. Real, undeniable, unshakable control. Langston leaned back, exhaustion and relief mingling in his posture. He had aged in the past hour. Years of pride and arrogance folded into a man who realized, finally, that power without conscience is fragile. Viva's fingers drummed on the polished wood, a rapid tattoo of pent-up fury. Yet there was hesitation there, too. The same hesitation I had once felt in moments of despair, uncertainty, a recognition that the narrative she had authored so long, in which I was the lesser sister, was officially over. I turned my gaze toward her, calm, deliberate. You know this isn't personal, Viva. Well, not in the petty ways you think it is. This is life correction. The kind that cannot be ignored. The kind that forces reflection. Her lips parted. Reflection? You call ruining Christmas Eve, digging up everything reflection. I smiled faintly. I call it justice. Balanced. Earned. Nonviolent. Unlike the years of humiliation and theft you inflicted on me, this is clean. Surgical. Precise. Darius exhaled sharply, a sound of quiet surrender, no doubt calculating how long it would take for him to regain even a semblance of influence. I let him stew. Let him feel the slow burn of accountability. Langston's voice cut through the tension, quieter now, almost reverent. Ilya, you've changed. Not just smarter, not just stronger, but you command respect. Respect. Yes, that's exactly it. You've underestimated me my entire life, I said softly, letting each word land like measured blows. I've been quiet, obedient, and careful, but the moment I had nothing left, I found clarity. And the clarity revealed exactly who I am, and who you all truly are when the masks fall. Viva's jaw tightened. You make it sound so noble, so heroic. But it's manipulation, that's all it is. I leaned forward, voice a whisper meant to pierce through her defenses. No, sister. This isn't manipulation. Manipulation assumes I have to control you. You've already done that for me. This is reckoning. You're free to act or flounder. But the power of truth doesn't require force. Langston's trembling hand reached for the pen again, not to sign, but to steady himself. He was a man discovering humility for the first time. A man confronting the consequences of decades of arrogance. And he couldn't avoid the gravity of my transformation. The girl who had been tossed onto frozen steps in a cashmere coat was now the orchestrator of her own destiny. I turned back to the tablet. I want the admissions to be clear. I want the public record to reflect what really happened, without embellishment or drama. And I want you to understand the scope of what could have been exposed, had I chosen differently. Langston swallowed audibly. He had learned one of life's hardest truths. Fear of accountability is a far stronger motivator than fear of punishment. And after that, he asked, his voice hoarse. I let silence stretch between us, thick and deliberate. Let him sit in anticipation, feel the gravity of the balance restored. After that, I said finally, you live with the consequences of your choices. I no longer belong to the narrative you've constructed. I belong to myself. And the only allegiance I owe is to my own integrity. Viva's eyes flashed with something I hadn't expected, recognition. Not approval, she wouldn't allow that, but recognition. She saw the finality in my tone, the calm authority. For the first time in her life, she understood that I wasn't a girl to be patronized, ignored, or manipulated. I was a force to be reckoned with. Darius made a small, hesitant step forward. Ilya, if we comply fully, there's a chance to salvage some relationships, some business. You don't want to annihilate us entirely, do you? I let the word annihilate hang in the air, silent but potent. Then I smiled faintly, almost gently. No, I don't want to annihilate. I want equilibrium. I want recognition. I want respect. And I want a future where I am not defined by your favoritism or arrogance. Langston's hand stilled. The pen hovered over the paper as he considered each word, each nuance. I saw the old man, the man who once wielded wealth and influence like a weapon, begin to dissolve into someone who understood the gravity of ethical responsibility. I took a measured step back, letting the room breathe around me. You've had your chance to teach me the ways of control, to test my patience, to define my limits. And now the lesson comes full circle. I'm giving you a chance to acknowledge the truth without coercion, without scandal, because that's what separates strength from tyranny. Viva's expression shifted subtly. For the first time, she didn't sneer. She didn't try to mask her frustration with sarcasm. She saw that I had become something entirely different, someone she couldn't categorize, someone she couldn't diminish. Langston exhaled slowly, the final signature slipping from his fingers. It's done, he said. I acknowledge your strength, your intelligence, and your right to reclaim what is yours. A shiver of satisfaction ran through me. Not gloating, not vengeance, just pure, unadulterated triumph. Not over them, but over the narrative they tried to impose on me. Darius leaned back, pale and silent. He wasn't defeated physically. He wasn't humiliated publicly. But he was undone in the only way that mattered. He had no leverage, no authority, no control over me. And Viva, I could see it in her eyes. She understood fully. The game had changed. The chessboard was mine. and I played with precision, patience, and foresight she had never possessed. I allowed myself one last glance around the room, a quiet, private smile. "Consider this the moment the balance of power shifted," I said softly. "The moment where the girl who was cast aside became untouchable. Not because of wealth, not because of vengeance, but because she finally learned to stand fully in her own strength." Langston nodded faintly. I see that now." Viva's lips pressed together, a tight, controlled line. Her fury had no target. She had nothing left to attack without exposing herself. Darius' face remained pale, tight, and thoughtful. He was already recalculating his next steps in a world where I was no longer anyone's subordinate. And me? I felt a weight lift, a breath of liberation. For the first time in my life, the power they had stolen from me was reclaimed fully. Not through retaliation, not through cruelty, but through clarity, strategy, and moral authority. The cold reality of Christmas Eve, the fog, the marble steps, the discarded suitcase, was finally balanced by a quiet, serene triumph. The girl who had been thrown out into the night had returned. Not to beg, not to cry, not to survive, but to stand fully, finally untouchable in the truth of her own power. The room had shifted. Every glance, every gesture, carried the invisible weight of new hierarchy. They had tried to define me, to contain me within the margins of their approval. And now, every one of those lines had been erased. Langston's fingers trembled slightly as he pushed the final signed document toward me. It wasn't the ink that mattered, it was the acknowledgement, the recognition that the world he had built could no longer contain me. I accepted it calmly, deliberately, feeling the cool weight of the papers in my hands. Each sheet was a small monument to months of preparation, to nights spent planning, to strategy executed flawlessly. Viva's voice broke the silence. "And what now? You've won your little war, but life doesn't stop. This doesn't end at all." I tilted my head, considering her words with the patience of someone who had seen the long game. "It's never about ending anything, Viva. It's about starting correctly. Starting where truth and accountability are not optional. Starting where I define my worth, not you. Not him. Not anyone." Her chest rose and fell quickly. She wanted to argue, to undermine, to reclaim control. But the air itself seemed to push back against her. Her arsenal of manipulation, so finely tuned over decades, had no effect anymore. Darius, ever the cautious opportunist, finally spoke, voice tight. "And if you ever change your mind? If you ever decide this isn't enough, what then?" I looked at him with a calm, almost clinical clarity. "Then you know the rules. Transparency. Accountability. You've seen the structure. You know what I can do. But for now, cooperation works better than conflict. It always does." Langston's eyes met mine, shadowed with vulnerability. "Elia, it wasn't easy for me to admit this. Or to act. But you've made me see the consequences of my choices." I nodded slightly. "And that's all I ever wanted. Not humiliation, not revenge, not even money. Just acknowledgement and fairness. Everything else flows naturally once that foundation exists." For the first time, the room felt almost light. The oppressive tension had shifted into something softer, though no less potent. Respect, fear, and admiration now coexisted in a delicate, unspoken balance. Viva's hands twitched at her sides. "You think you've changed everything, but you'll never be the same as us. You'll never have what we have." I allowed a soft, almost indulgent smile. "Perhaps, but I also won't have what I never needed. You call it power, I call it freedom. And that freedom is priceless." Langston exhaled, releasing a tension he hadn't known he carried. "You're extraordinary. I see that now. And perhaps, in the smallest way, I can learn from you." Viva's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Darius stayed silent as well, the lesson sinking in deeper than words could convey. I glanced at the clock on the wall, an elegant, old-world timepiece that had once felt imposing in this room. Time had shifted. I had shifted. The past, with its betrayals and humiliations, was now firmly behind me. The future was mine to define. "I need a moment," I said softly, stepping back from the desk. I moved toward the window, watching the last traces of fog swirl outside, illuminated by the soft glow of the estate's lamps. The cold, sharp air of that Christmas Eve still lingered in memory, but now it carried a different meaning. A reminder not of weakness, but of resilience. Langston followed me quietly, standing slightly behind. "Elia, whatever you decide to do next, know this. I will support it, if only because I now understand what you are capable of." I didn't respond immediately. Words weren't necessary. The acknowledgement was enough. The sound of distant engines caught my attention. My pulse quickened, not in fear, but in anticipation. Outside, the driveway glistened with frost under the early evening lights. And there, in the subtle glow, appeared a line of black BMWs, familiar, impeccable, almost ceremonial. The same pattern of precision that had first drawn me into the orbit of Madame Odora Street Clare. I smiled, quiet and self-contained. The vehicles were a reminder of the larger world I had stepped into, a world where power was wielded with elegance, strategy, and discretion. A world where I could be unafraid, where I could finally stand untouchable. Langston exhaled softly. "Do you have help?" I turned to him, calm, commanding. "I have more than help. I have strategy, foresight, and people who understand the true meaning of loyalty. Something you tried to teach me with harshness, but only now do I fully grasp." Viva's breath hitched slightly. Her fury remained, but it had been tempered by reality. She could sense the unassailable position I now held, not through wealth alone, but through intelligence, patience, and moral clarity. Darius' face tightened. "You're unstoppable." I let the word linger. It wasn't boastful. It was a statement of truth. Unstoppable, not because I desired destruction, but because I had learned to turn betrayal into advantage, pain into precision, and exclusion into empowerment. I moved back toward the desk, picking up the final document and sliding it carefully into the leather folder I had brought. The weight in my hands was symbolic. A culmination of months of planning, of sleepless nights, of calculating every risk and opportunity. "This," I said softly, placing the folder in front of Langston, "is the bridge. Not just to reclaim what was mine, but to establish what fairness and integrity truly mean. Use it wisely, or do nothing, and the consequences will follow naturally." Langston's hand hovered over the folder, trembling slightly, the weight of responsibility pressing down. He understood fully now. This wasn't a threat. This was empowerment, accountability, and a final reckoning that could not be undone. Viva's eyes softened fractionally, not with approval, but with reluctant acknowledgement. Darius' tight jaw betrayed that he understood as well. I straightened, letting my shoulders relax. For the first time in years, the sense of being powerless had vanished entirely. The fog of betrayal, the chilling winds of abandonment, the cold marble steps, all had been transformed into something far stronger. Clarity, control, and a vision for the future that was entirely my own. And in that room, under the quiet, watching gaze of the estate that had once symbolized confinement, I realized something crucial. Victory wasn't loud, it wasn't brutal, and it didn't require vengeance. Victory was subtle, intelligent, and permanent. I glanced one last time at Langston, then at Viva, then at Darius. "This is only the beginning," I said softly. "But now the world will see me as I am, and no one will ever question it again." Langston nodded, the corners of his eyes crinkling with something resembling pride. Viva's lips pressed together in silent fury, restrained but present. Darius' eyes reflected calculation, fear, and awe all at once. And I felt the first true rush of liberation, of unshakable control. I had been discarded, humiliated, and left to the night. But I had returned not broken, not bitter, but untouchable, fully and finally untouchable. The black BMWs outside glinted under the estate lights, perfectly aligned, silent sentinels awaiting my next move. Each car was a promise, power, protection, and discretion. But more than that, they were a signal. The world I was stepping into was vast, calculated, and precise. And I finally was no longer the pawn, I was the player. Claudia O'Neill's voice broke the tense silence behind me. "Madame Odora is waiting for you. She will explain the remainder of your inheritance and guide you through the next steps. But she has asked that you arrive alone." I nodded, calm but alert. Alone. That was a test. One I welcomed. I had spent months learning how to navigate situations like this. How to assess threats, read intentions, and turn every observation into leverage. As I walked toward the waiting car, my heels clicked softly on the marble floors. Every step reinforced the transformation I had undergone. I was no longer the girl shivering on the park bench. No longer the powerless sister who had been tossed out like garbage. Each step now carried purpose, authority, and unspoken challenge. The lead BMW door opened automatically, welcoming me into a leather-lined interior that smelled faintly of jasmine and new leather, a combination both luxurious and calming. I slid into the seat, straight-backed, alert. The car glided silently through the foggy streets, the engine almost imperceptible, the drive a study in quiet precision. "Where are we going?" I asked softly, more as a conversational starter than a necessity. "Home," Claudia replied. "At least for the next few hours. Madame Odora prefers discretion, and her estate is private, to say the least." I allowed a small smile. "Private. Perfect. Just the way I like things. Transparency, control, and loyalty, but only on my terms." As the car moved, my mind replayed the events of the last 48 hours. The shock of my family's betrayal, the raw sting of being disinherited, and the bitter humiliation of seeing Viva's smugness unfold on social media. Every step had been painful, but each had taught me something crucial. Power without patience is fleeting. Intelligence without strategy is wasted. Kindness, even when seemingly ignored, holds untold potential. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the hum of the BMW's engine synchronize with my thoughts. When I opened them again, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the winding roads lined with towering trees and wrought iron fences. The estate ahead was partially visible, a sprawling mansion Georgian style, with ivy creeping up the columns, lights glowing warmly against the dark night. The sense of history and control it radiated was palpable. The gates opened silently, almost ceremoniously. Claudia glanced at me briefly, eyes sharp. "You're about to meet someone who sees the world differently. But don't underestimate her. Madame Odora doesn't tolerate weakness or dishonesty, and she has a way of exposing both in ways you might not anticipate." I nodded once quietly. I had spent years learning to read people. I had endured betrayal, manipulation, and arrogance. I had learned to anticipate, adapt, and strike when least expected. Madame Odora would not intimidate me. Not now. The car pulled into a circular drive, and I stepped out, the soft crunch of gravel under my heels grounding me. A fountain gurgled quietly nearby, surrounded by manicured gardens that whispered wealth and taste. And there she was, Madame Odora Street Claire herself, waiting with impeccable posture, hands clasped in front of her, eyes sharp and assessing, yet not unkind. "You're punctual," she said, voice smooth, deliberate. "I like that. Many people think they can arrive late and make up for lost time with charm. Charm is a currency, yes, but only when paired with competence and judgment. You, I have observed, possess both. And perhaps a touch more courage than I expected." I smiled faintly, carefully measured. "Thank you, madam. Your reputation precedes you. I won't disappoint." She studied me for a long moment, the kind of observation that felt like she was assessing not just my surface, but my inner framework, my instincts, my morality, my capacity for strategic thought. Then, slowly, she gestured for me to follow her inside the mansion. The interior was breathtaking. Marble floors stretched across vast corridors, accented by rich mahogany, oil paintings that whispered centuries of history, and chandeliers that refracted light like liquid gold. But it wasn't the opulence that struck me. It was the sense of order, control, and foresight embedded in every corner. This was a place built on precision, intelligence, and influence. A reflection, I realized, of the woman I was about to meet. "Please sit," Madame Odora said, leading me to a study lined with bookshelves reaching the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and aged paper, a comforting yet commanding aroma. She gestured toward a chair opposite her desk, and I lowered myself gracefully, heels clicking softly. "You've already demonstrated resilience," she began, voice deliberate, "and the ability to turn adversity into advantage. Most people crumble when confronted with betrayal, humiliation, or exclusion. You did something rare. You responded with clarity, strategy, and most importantly, morality. That makes you valuable, very valuable." I nodded, allowing the words to register fully. Value, not just monetary, but influence, judgment, foresight. These were the currencies I had learned to cherish. She leaned back slightly, studying me over the rim of her glasses. "Your family, they made assumptions. They thought disinheritance would break you. That humiliation would control you. They underestimated one crucial factor: your capacity to see beyond the immediate, to plan with foresight, and to act without ego interfering with morality." "Yes," I said softly, almost to myself. "They underestimated me. And now," she continued, voice almost conspiratorial, "you stand at a crossroads. You have reclaimed what was taken, yes, but you also have an opportunity to shape influence, networks, and power in ways few ever experience. You can choose to protect, to guide, to expand, or you can destroy. I trust you understand that true power is never about vengeance. It's about alignment, alignment of vision, strategy, and morality. I let her words sink in. Every lesson of the last months, the cold, the abandonment, the humiliation, had prepared me for this moment. I understood fully. Destruction was simple. Control, influence, respect, and foresight that required intellect, courage, and patience. Madame Odora leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing with focus. I've brought you here for one reason, Elia. I want to mentor you. Not as a servant, not as an heir by default, but as a strategist. Someone who understands influence without losing morality. Someone who can command loyalty without fear. Someone who can act decisively, with foresight and ethics. Do you accept this path? I met her gaze, feeling the weight and the possibility all at once. Yes, I said finally. I accept, and I will prove that your faith is not misplaced. She smiled faintly, a gesture both approving and challenging. Good. Then let us begin. And in that moment, standing in the heart of a mansion that symbolized power, legacy, and strategy, I realized the truth. I had been discarded once. I had been abandoned. I had faced humiliation and betrayal. And now, I was unstoppable. Not because of wealth alone, not because of revenge, but because I had learned to convert pain into clarity, humiliation into foresight, and exclusion into absolute strategic advantage. The study was quiet, yet charged like the air before a storm. Madame Odora moved with a grace that suggested decades of unshakable control. Every gesture, every word had purpose. I felt it immediately, the kind of mentorship that demanded more than obedience. It demanded observation, patience, and intellectual rigor. First lesson, she said, settling behind her mahogany desk, hands folded over an open ledger. Power is never revealed all at once. It is accrued, layered, and strategically unveiled. People will test you, try to undermine your position. Your task is not merely to respond. It is to anticipate. I nodded, absorbing every syllable. Her voice, measured and deliberate, carried a weight that made each concept tangible. Anticipate, I echoed softly. It wasn't a command, it was a mantra. She smiled faintly. Exactly. Now let's discuss your family situation. Her gaze sharpened. Viva. Your father. Your ex. They represent a set of variables, predictable yet dangerous. Your task is to navigate them without overt aggression. The satisfaction of subtlety far outweighs the momentary pleasure of overt vengeance. I leaned back, considering her words. Subtlety had been my ally so far. Humiliation at the hands of my family had taught me one undeniable truth. Brute force or reactive anger only leaves scars on yourself. Patience, strategy, and precision left scars where they mattered, on those who underestimated you. You need allies, she continued, voice softening slightly. Not sycophants, not yes men, not temporary associates who will vanish when challenges arise. Real allies, people whose loyalty is earned, whose skills complement your own, and whose judgment you trust implicitly. Without them, even the most brilliant strategy can fail. I nodded again, absorbing the nuance. I already had Claudia, a trusted executor. But Madame Odora's emphasis on loyalty went beyond superficial trust. It required observation, testing, and understanding the invisible motivations driving those around you. Tomorrow, she said, standing and moving to a tall bookshelf, you will meet several individuals who will become instrumental in your next phase. Each one possesses unique skills: finance, legal oversight, communications, intelligence gathering. Their loyalty must be assessed, tested, and refined. Failure to do so could undermine everything. I followed her gaze to the bookshelves, rows upon rows of meticulously organized tomes. Strategy, law, history, economics, psychology. Each volume a weapon, each concept a tool to be wielded. I felt a shiver, not from intimidation, but from anticipation. I had been preparing for this, whether I knew it or not. Madame Odora turned, her eyes piercing mine. You've seen your family's true colors. You've been betrayed. You've felt humiliation, fear, and exclusion. These emotions are powerful, but they are also volatile. Do not let them dictate your actions. Instead, channel them. Convert them into focus, clarity, and resolve. I exhaled slowly, letting her words sink into the core of my being. Focus, clarity, resolve. Yes, that had been the difference between me and the people who thought they could discard me without consequence. I had the patience to wait, the intelligence to observe, and now, the mentorship to act decisively. She gestured toward a table set with documents and digital tablets. The next step is subtle infiltration, reclaiming influence without confrontation. You'll need to understand their weaknesses, motivations, and insecurities. Information is power, but context is control. And control is the currency that allows you to operate without compromise. I moved closer, studying the materials. Profiles, financial statements, schedules, digital footprints. Everything I could need to map the landscape. Viva's arrogance, Darius' smug entitlement, even Langston's internal conflicts. All of it carefully documented. This was intelligence, not gossip. Precision, not impulse. Madame Odora's voice cut through my thoughts. Remember this, the thrill of revenge is fleeting. The power of strategy is enduring. Your family believed they could humiliate you, push you to the edge, and control your trajectory. They underestimated your capacity for foresight and your willingness to act decisively when the moment is right. I glanced at her, absorbing the subtle emphasis. When the moment is right. Not now. Not hastily. Patience. Precision. Timing. All had been my allies from the moment I was forced onto the frozen steps that Christmas Eve. She moved closer, resting a hand lightly on the back of my chair. You've endured cold, hunger, and rejection. You've seen the cruelty of people you trusted most. But tonight, you will learn something more important than wealth or power: resilience. True resilience is the ability to operate under pressure, to anticipate threats, and to execute with calm precision when chaos seems inevitable. I felt a tightness in my chest, an echo of that night on the park bench, when my fingers were numb, my teeth chattering, and my heart racing with despair. But that memory no longer carried pain. It carried instruction. It was a map of what not to do, and a guide to what I must become. Tomorrow, she continued, you will begin testing the loyalty of those closest to you. Every conversation, every interaction, every subtle gesture must be observed. Look for cracks, small ones barely perceptible. People reveal themselves in the minutiae. Your job is to notice, analyze, and act only when the pattern is undeniable. I absorbed the instructions, mentally cataloging the steps. This wasn't just about revenge or reclaiming what was taken. It was about establishing a new hierarchy. A hierarchy where I was no longer invisible, discarded, or underestimated. Before you leave tonight, Madame Odora added, there is one final exercise. I want you to reflect, not on what was lost, but on what you've gained. The pain, humiliation, and betrayal you endured are assets. They teach you where to be cautious, where to trust, and where to strike with subtlety. You've seen their weaknesses firsthand. Use that knowledge and never let emotion cloud your judgment. I nodded, closing my eyes briefly. I could feel the cumulative weight of every insult, every slight, every moment of abandonment. And yet, for the first time in months, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like fuel, a refined, concentrated energy that could be directed, controlled, and deployed with deadly precision. Madame Odora's voice softened slightly. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, the work begins in earnest. And remember, Elia, your greatest strength is not your wealth or position. It's your mind, your patience, your ability to act when others are blinded by emotion. Never forget that. I rose, feeling a surge of confidence unlike anything I had experienced since that first frozen night. I won't, I said softly. I understand. She smiled faintly, a gesture both approving and challenging. Good. Because from this point forward, you are not merely surviving. You are operating. Strategically. Intelligently. And with purpose. The BMWs awaited outside, their black surfaces gleaming under the soft glow of the estate lights. I felt the familiar thrill, not of fear but of anticipation. The world was vast, the stakes high, and every move I made from this point forward would carry consequence. But now I was ready. Every humiliation, every betrayal, every cold night alone had led me here. And I would not be denied. Morning came like a whisper, soft and deliberate, the estate bathed in pale sunlight that filtered through perfectly trimmed hedges. I woke in the guest suite, the kind of room that balanced understated elegance with functionality. No gaudy excess, just controlled power reflected in every detail. Madame Odora had left me a note. Observe, prepare, and anticipate. Today, the real work begins. I dressed methodically, choosing dark, tailored clothing that allowed mobility without sacrificing authority. Every choice was deliberate. Every detail mattered. Today, I was no longer a displaced daughter. I was a strategist stepping into the arena. Claudia greeted me in the hallway, her expression composed, yet tinged with subtle approval. Good morning, Elia. Breakfast is ready. We have a schedule to review, and I've prepared the dossiers you'll need for your initial evaluations. I nodded, following her into the dining room where a spread of fresh fruit, eggs, and perfectly brewed coffee awaited. But food was secondary. My mind was already racing through contingencies, observing the subtle cues in the room. Placement of objects, layout of chairs, line of sight. All details that could be leveraged later. Who will I be meeting first? I asked, keeping my tone calm, deliberate. Claudia handed me a folder. Viva. She's predictable, impulsive, and overconfident. She won't realize you've already assessed her vulnerabilities. A slow smile crept across my face. Perfect. I flipped through the folder, scanning financial details, recent social activity, even minor indulgences. Everything that revealed personality, ambition, and ego. Viva had grown complacent. Darius had grown arrogant. Langston had grown comfortable in his own self-importance. Each one underestimated me, and that would be their undoing. Timing is critical, Claudia added, as if reading my thoughts. You must orchestrate every interaction to maximize information extraction while minimizing exposure. I nodded silently, sipping coffee and letting the warmth ground me. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer reactive survival. This was active strategy. Every word, every glance, every gesture would be measured, recorded, and analyzed. The first encounter was scheduled for mid-morning in the estate's library, a grand room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, plush leather chairs, and a fireplace that, though unlit, radiated authority. The light from the tall windows cast precise shadows across the marble floor, almost theatrical in its framing. When Viva arrived, she was exactly as predicted, poised, self-assured, and entirely unaware. Her red silk blouse caught the light, the diamond on her finger glinting with arrogance. She smiled, sweet and venomous, the kind of smile that only those accustomed to privilege can produce without realizing its toxicity. "Elia," she exclaimed, voice dripping with faux concern. "It's surprising to see you here. I didn't think you'd actually." Her sentence faltered under my steady gaze. I leaned back slightly, maintaining perfect composure. "Good morning, Viva. I thought it best to address our differences directly. Transparency seems overdue." Her eyes flickered with discomfort. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She was off balance. Exactly where I wanted her. We exchanged pleasantries, measured but carefully loaded with subtle implications. Each phrase was a probe, each question a test of her ego and defenses. I let her talk, revealing patterns, vulnerabilities, and arrogance in equal measure. Every smirk, every gesture, every pause was data, a roadmap to influence. By the time our session ended, I had already begun formulating a plan. Subtle interventions, carefully orchestrated social nudges, and minor financial maneuvers that would slowly shift perception, influence, and power without her realizing until it was too late. Claudia appeared quietly at my side as Viva left, her expression approving. "Well executed," she said softly. "You maintained control without overt aggression. That is key. People are most vulnerable when they believe they are in control." I exhaled slowly, feeling the satisfaction of subtle mastery. Control without confrontation. Influence without violence. Every lesson Madame Odora had emphasized was now actionable. The next meetings followed similar patterns. Darius, full of self-satisfaction and smug confidence, fell into predictable conversational traps. Langston, careful and calculating, revealed more than he intended when subtly challenged on financial forecasts and estate allocations. Each interaction was a layer, each observation a weapon to be wielded later. By late afternoon, I had accumulated enough insight to begin constructing my first series of strategic moves. I retreated to the study, reviewing notes, cross-referencing vulnerabilities, and drafting precise, calculated actions that would unfold over the coming weeks. Every email, every meeting, every casual interaction could be leveraged if orchestrated correctly. Madame Odora entered silently, standing behind me as I reviewed my plans. "You are progressing faster than expected," she noted, her voice low and deliberate. "But remember, patience. The smallest misstep can unravel the entire structure. Timing, precision, and subtlety remain paramount." I nodded, internalizing her words. The thrill of this meticulous planning was intoxicating. I had spent years feeling powerless, humiliated, and discarded. Now every observation, every interaction, every calculated maneuver was proof of the transformation I had undergone. As the sun began to dip behind the estate's hedges, casting long shadows across the study floor, I realized something profound. Revenge, when executed with strategy and foresight, wasn't merely about retaliation. It was about reclamation, reclaiming dignity, influence, and agency. I closed the folder, a quiet sense of anticipation building in my chest. The first phase of the plan had been executed: observation, assessment, and strategic positioning. The next phase, subtle manipulation, influence, and controlled exposure, would begin in the coming days. Each step would be precise, deliberate, and unavoidable. For the first time since that Christmas Eve, I felt an unshakable certainty. I was no longer reactive. I was proactive. And in that certainty lay the promise of absolute, unstoppable influence. The night settled over the estate, quiet yet potent, a mirror to the calm before a storm. I moved to the window, gazing out at the perfectly aligned black BMWs, glinting under the soft glow of estate lighting. Every reflection, every shadow, every detail was a reminder. I had been discarded once. I would not be discarded again. This time I was the architect, and the storm I was about to unleash would be precise, calculated, and inevitable. The next morning, the estate buzzed with quiet activity. Staff moved with practiced precision, and the sunlight streaming through the windows painted the rooms in warm, golden hues. But beneath the calm surface, tension simmered, mine and theirs alike. Every corridor, every hallway, every encounter was an opportunity to observe, influence, and shape the outcome. Claudia met me in the hallway with a subtle nod. Today, we expand influence into their network. You will engage not only with family, but also with their allies, friends, and partners. Perception is everything. Influence perception, and the dominoes will begin to fall. I adjusted my coat, feeling the weight of preparation and anticipation. Each move required patience and precision. I had learned the value of subtlety the hard way. One misstep, one overt display of anger or desperation, and the plan could collapse. Our first stop was a private brunch at a high-end club favored by San Francisco's elite. Viva arrived with her usual entourage, a carefully curated display of status, wealth, and charm. She didn't notice my calm, measured presence as I entered the room. That was my advantage. The element of invisibility, of underestimated competence, was mine to wield. "Good morning, Elia," she said with the faintest trace of forced civility. Her smile, though polished, didn't reach her eyes. Subtle cracks. That was enough. "Good morning, Viva," I replied evenly, letting my tone carry just enough warmth to disarm suspicion while maintaining authority. I positioned myself strategically at the table, choosing a seat that allowed unobstructed observation of her gestures, reactions, and interactions. Throughout the brunch, I listened more than I spoke. Each word, each slip of phrasing, each hint of arrogance or insecurity was catalogued. Darius' casual boasts about a new venture revealed overconfidence. Langston's dismissive remarks hinted at an over-reliance on superficial measures of competence. And Viva, her carefully rehearsed charm, faltered ever so slightly when I introduced subtle counterpoints to her statements. Claudia's voice came softly in my ear. "Notice their overextensions. Each one believes they control the narrative. Let them. Their misjudgments will be your advantage." By mid-brunch, I had quietly planted seeds. Innocuous suggestions, casual remarks, questions that appeared benign but would trigger subtle self-doubt. Every microinteraction was a strategic nudge, gently displacing confidence and creating openings for influence. After brunch, we returned to the estate. Madame Odora was waiting, her presence calm, yet electrifying in its command. "You've done well," she noted. "The first stage of influence is complete. They are beginning to reveal their vulnerabilities. The next step is amplification, subtle, public, and undeniable, yet deniable in its orchestration." I studied her carefully. Amplification. A clever escalation, one that would heighten tension and expose flaws without overt confrontation. This was the art of strategy at its finest, leveraging observation into influence, influence into control, and control into decisive advantage. The afternoon was spent refining the sequence of maneuvers. Each interaction, each message, each meeting was mapped with meticulous care. Timing, placement, and perception were critical. A misstep could undo weeks of preparation. But every subtle adjustment strengthened my position, eroded their overconfidence, and laid the groundwork for the final stages. As evening approached, I walked the estate's gardens alone, reviewing the psychological landscape in my mind. The frost glinted under the setting sun, and the bare trees cast long shadows across the paths. I imagined the cascading effects of the subtle manipulations I had set in motion. The social shifts, the financial consequences, the delicate unraveling of their arrogance. The memory of that Christmas Eve returned with sharp clarity. The cold, the humiliation, the feeling of being discarded. But this time, the emotion was transformed. It was no longer despair. It was fuel, calm, measured, and precise. That night had forged resilience. Every calculated move now converted that resilience into strategic advantage. Madame Odora joined me in the garden silently. "You understand why patience is essential," she said softly. "The smallest ripple can become a wave if directed carefully. Your family believes they have discarded you. But now, you are the unseen hand guiding outcomes. Every misstep they make will reflect not weakness on your part, but foresight and control." I nodded, feeling the weight of truth in her words. The thrill of strategy, of control, and of subtle influence coursing through me was intoxicating. I had moved from victim to orchestrator, from powerless to inevitable. "Tomorrow," she continued, "we introduce a controlled public variable, something that will simultaneously heighten pressure, reveal cracks, and allow you to maintain the illusion of innocence. People are most vulnerable when they believe they are in control. Your task is to leverage that vulnerability without overt action." I considered her words, understanding the subtle complexity. This wasn't about confrontation. This was about exposure, influence, and the artful revelation of weakness. They would not see it coming. They would not suspect until it was far too late. Night settled over the estate like a velvet curtain, the garden paths glittering with frost and moonlight. I returned to my suite, reviewing notes, refining sequences, and anticipating outcomes. Every interaction, every detail, every subtle nudge was documented, analyzed, and scheduled. This was no longer about survival. This was about absolute, calculated orchestration. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the undeniable thrill of inevitability. The family that had discarded me, humiliated me, and assumed my powerlessness would soon confront a reality they could not anticipate, and it would be devastatingly precise. Elia Vance was no longer invisible. She was strategic, patient, and unstoppable. And the reckoning, the carefully orchestrated culmination of months of subtle influence and observation, was only beginning. The storm was approaching, and this time it would leave no room for mercy. The next morning, the estate hummed with activity as if anticipating the subtle shifts about to unfold. I moved deliberately through the halls, noting every small detail. The placement of a pen on Langston's desk, the faint smudge on Viva's smartphone screen, the ever-present aura of overconfidence radiating from Darius. Each observation was a potential lever, and I cataloged them meticulously. Claudia joined me quietly in the library. "Today we begin the public phase," she said. "It will appear natural, accidental, even generous. But each action is calculated to expose their overconfidence and reveal vulnerabilities. Remember, perception is as potent as reality." I nodded. Perception as weapon. The phrase resonated in my mind. My family had underestimated the power of subtle influence, and that miscalculation was about to cost them dearly. Our first target, Viva's social circle. A charity event was scheduled for the evening, one she had been planning for months. The perfect stage to expose cracks in her composure and authority. I reviewed her schedule, noting key allies, influential guests, and potential weak points. Every interaction had a purpose. When we arrived, the atmosphere was vibrant, clinking glasses, laughter, and the soft hum of a live string quartet. Viva was at the center, radiant and commanding attention, yet there was a trace of tension in her movements, subtle but perceptible to anyone paying attention. Perfect. I approached casually, allowing my presence to be noticed but not immediately engaged. The subtle shift in her posture when she saw me was almost imperceptible, a fraction of hesitation, a barely noticeable pause in her practiced smile. Claudia's hand brushed my shoulder lightly. The first ripple is occurring. Viva approached, masking her unease with an overcompensating charm. "Elia, how wonderful to see you here. I wasn't expecting, well, you to attend." Her tone held a subtle edge, like a knife cloaked in silk. "Good evening, Viva," I replied evenly, allowing a faint smile to disarm without inviting confrontation. "I thought it important to observe your hard work firsthand. You've clearly invested a great deal into this event." Her eyes flicked briefly toward her staff, her smile tightening. I could see the strain beneath the surface, her meticulous planning suddenly feeling fragile under the quiet scrutiny of someone she had assumed powerless. Throughout the evening, I allowed myself to blend into the social fabric, subtly steering conversations, gently introducing ideas that highlighted her overextensions, and noting alliances and dependencies. Small, seemingly innocuous comments from me began to trigger doubt and reevaluation in those around her. By the end of the night, several influential attendees had subtly shifted their attention toward my suggestions, all without my overt intervention. Claudia's voice was soft in my ear, almost a whisper. Observe how she falters under the illusion of scrutiny. This is the power of subtle influence. No confrontation. No overt challenge. Just perception. The strategy was working. Viva's confident facade wavered, tiny fissures appearing in her carefully constructed veneer. And as I noted her gestures, tightened jaw, glances darting toward me, subtle foot taps of impatience, I realized the meticulous preparation and patient observation had created the perfect opening. Returning to the estate, I retreated to my study to review the night's outcomes. Every slip, every hesitation, every subtle misalignment had been cataloged and analyzed. My mental map of vulnerabilities and leverage points was now more complete. Madame Odora appeared without announcement, a calm presence in the room. "You are progressing faster than anticipated," she said. "But remember, the appearance of control is essential. You must remain the observer, the strategist. Let them miscalculate. Let them believe they are still in command." I nodded, savoring the quiet thrill of watching long-ignored weaknesses begin to surface. The evening had been more than a social success. It had been a demonstration of control without visible force, influence without confrontation, and authority without claim. The next day, I shifted focus to Langston and Darius. Each had their own predictable patterns of behavior, and both were susceptible to strategic nudges that would slowly erode confidence and expose arrogance. I mapped out a series of interactions over the coming weeks, meetings, presentations, and social gatherings, all carefully designed to trigger overconfidence, miscalculation, and the slow unraveling of their self-assurance. By the time the sun set, the estate was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The frost from the previous nights glimmered like diamonds across the grounds, a quiet testament to the clarity and precision of the plan. I walked the garden paths alone, letting my mind wander through contingencies, anticipating reactions, and imagining the eventual culmination. Every decision, every subtle maneuver, every calculated observation was converging toward a singular objective: the undeniable revelation of truth, power, and consequence. Claudia appeared silently, offering a quiet presence. "You must maintain patience," she said. "Even now, every action must appear accidental, even generous. The smallest misstep can compromise perception. Remember, Elia, their hubris is your ally. It blinds them to your strategy." I exhaled slowly, feeling the calm exhilaration of control. The past humiliation, the cold and fear of that Christmas Eve, now felt distant, transformed into fuel for careful orchestration. My family had discarded me, underestimated me, and assumed my weakness. Now, every calculated move was the invisible hand shaping outcomes they could not anticipate. Night fell, and the estate grew quiet. The black BMWs gleamed under the soft illumination of strategically placed lighting, silent sentinels, symbols of influence, precision, and reach. I stood at the window, tracing their sleek lines with my gaze. The vehicles were more than transport. They were a constant reminder of the resources, power, and strategic advantage at my disposal. Elia Vance was no longer a bystander. She was orchestrator, strategist, and observer, a force moving with precision and patience toward a reckoning long overdue. And with every calculated step, the culmination of months of subtle manipulation and observation drew closer. The storm was gathering, and when it struck, it would be inescapable, irreversible, and devastatingly precise. The next morning, I awoke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The events of the past weeks had transformed something inside me. No longer was I the discarded daughter shivering on a park bench. Now I was a strategist, a tactician, and an orchestrator of outcomes invisible to those who believed themselves in control. Claudia met me in the sunlit hallway, her expression calm but sharp. "Today we escalate. Subtle pressure becomes undeniable influence. Your family will begin to overextend, revealing cracks they cannot hide. Remember, patience, subtlety, and timing are everything." I followed her instructions methodically. The first target was Viva. I had arranged for an intimate lunch with several influential socialites, women who had always regarded her as a paragon of charm and status. I knew that by carefully introducing alternative viewpoints and gently redirecting their admiration, I could create fissures in her carefully curated image. Viva arrived, radiant in a silk emerald blouse, but her composure was already fraying. She smiled brightly, masking tension. I returned the greeting with quiet poise. "It's lovely to see so many accomplished women gathered here," I said, letting my words carry authority without aggression. Over the course of the lunch, I dropped subtle hints about resource allocation, charity priorities, and social influence. Innocuous questions, polite challenges, and observations carefully framed as curiosity began to ripple through the table. The women's attention subtly shifted from Viva to me. Small glances, slight nods, murmurs of agreement, all indicated perception was bending in my favor. Viva's eyes flickered, that tiny hesitation I had been waiting for. Every measured comment I made forced her to adjust, to recalculate. And the cracks grew. Her smile stiffened. Her hand twitched slightly as she reached for a napkin. I could see the tension rising with every subtle cue, each one unnoticed by the others, but painfully obvious to me. By mid-afternoon, I had completed the first layer of influence. Small victories, but strategic. I had positioned myself as competent, perceptive, and calm under observation, while Viva appeared increasingly frazzled and reactive. Claudia's soft voice reminded me, "Let them misjudge. Let them overextend. The key is not confrontation, it is exposure." The next target was Darius. He had always relied on charm, timing, and the illusion of foresight. I carefully engineered a series of chance encounters. Coincidental meetings at cafes, casual questions about investments, subtle references to overlooked risks. Each interaction was designed to highlight his overconfidence, to plant seeds of doubt in both him and his network. When Darius invited me to an informal dinner, I accepted, fully aware of the opportunities it presented. Throughout the evening, I allowed him to dominate conversation initially, subtly redirecting discussions with questions that exposed minor inconsistencies in his statements. He laughed, brushed off observations, but I saw the flicker of doubt. One slight misstep in phrasing, one tiny hesitation. These were my openings, and I cataloged them meticulously. Langston was next. His arrogance and belief in his own omniscience made him predictable. I scheduled a series of casual meetings under the guise of seeking guidance. At each interaction, I introduced minor, plausible suggestions that contradicted his assumptions, forcing him to adjust or over-explain. The irritation was subtle at first, then more noticeable. His hand gestures became sharper. His voice, usually calm, had brief spikes of tension. By the third meeting, the first visible crack in his facade had emerged. A slight tremor of frustration when a seemingly minor detail didn't conform to his expectations. Returning to the estate that evening, I felt the slow thrill of progress. The subtle manipulations were working. Their overconfidence, arrogance, and habitual assumptions were being exposed, not through confrontation or anger, but through carefully orchestrated influence and perception control. Each interaction, every carefully chosen word, was a silent blow, a blow that would accumulate into something undeniable. Madame Odora appeared as I reviewed my notes. "You are progressing faster than anticipated," she observed. "Patience will continue to be your ally. They will continue to reveal vulnerabilities, miscalculate, and overextend. Your role is to observe, guide, and capitalize without overt action. Subtlety is the instrument of precision." I nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The transformation from powerless exile to orchestrator of influence was nearly complete. I was no longer reacting. I was leading, guiding, and positioning my family toward outcomes they could not anticipate. And the most satisfying part, they would never know I had done it until the final moment of revelation. That night, alone in my suite, I allowed myself a brief reflection. The humiliation, the cold, the betrayal of Christmas Eve. The memory still stung, but it was no longer a wound. It was a catalyst, transformed into strategy, patience, and careful orchestration. Each subtle move over the past weeks had been a tribute to survival, intelligence, and precision. And now, the stage was set for the next phase. The amplification of exposure, the orchestration of undeniable consequences, and the beginning of the first visible ripples of public reckoning. As I lay in bed, I visualized the cascade. Viva's social miscalculations would spread subtly among influential networks. Darius' overconfidence would create missteps that compounded over time. Langston's arrogance would continue to blind him, forcing misjudgments that left him vulnerable. Each action, each ripple, perfectly timed, perfectly executed. Elia Vance was no longer the powerless daughter discarded on Christmas Eve. She was the strategist, the observer, and the orchestrator of an inevitable reckoning. And the storm she had patiently nurtured over weeks was now ready to begin its silent, unstoppable surge. The following morning, the estate felt different. Not outwardly. It still radiated the quiet opulence of wealth, but beneath the surface, a subtle tension hung in the air. I noticed it immediately. The way the staff moved a little faster, the way Viva's laughter at breakfast seemed slightly forced, the way Darius kept glancing at his phone, a hint of impatience flickering in his eyes. The subtle ripples of influence I had set in motion were already manifesting. Claudia joined me in the breakfast room, her presence quiet yet commanding. "Observe," she instructed softly. "The first cracks will begin to widen naturally today. Each misstep you provoke is an opportunity for them to expose more than they realize." Viva's phone buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of the tiny fissures forming in her social circle. She excused herself repeatedly to respond to messages, her carefully curated image fraying with every tap. I sat calmly, sipping my coffee, letting her self-inflicted chaos unfold. By mid-morning, Darius had arranged an impromptu meeting with investors, confident in his pitch and unaware of the small seeds of doubt I had planted. I attended, ostensibly to observe and provide moral support, but my presence was anything but neutral. Subtle questions, innocuous suggestions, and carefully framed observations began to erode the carefully constructed narrative he had rehearsed. His responses were initially confident, but I noticed the tiniest signs of hesitation. The fraction of a pause, a hand gripping the tabletop a little tighter, eyes darting slightly. Each subtle hesitation was a crack widening under pressure. Langston's turn came that afternoon. I requested a casual discussion about estate management, ostensibly to seek guidance. He leaned back in his chair, exuding authority, confident that his experience would dominate the conversation. But each carefully crafted question I posed challenged assumptions he had never examined. Small inconsistencies in his logic were highlighted gently, yet unmistakably. He stiffened, fumbled his usual effortless charm, and left the meeting with a rare flicker of doubt shadowing his normally confident expression. Claudia's soft whisper reached me again. "They are beginning to bend under perception. Your family believes themselves in control, but the weight of subtle exposure is already reshaping the landscape. Let it continue." By evening, I had orchestrated the first public consequences of my influence. A minor social miscalculation by Viva, an overlooked RSVP, a double-booked event, was magnified subtly through conversations I had carefully seeded earlier. Influential attendees noticed, murmurs spread, and the perception of her flawless charm began to wobble. She laughed it off, but I could see the tension beneath the surface. Exactly as planned. Darius, meanwhile, experienced the consequences of overconfidence. A minor oversight in his pitch, amplified through subtly shared information with investors, created hesitation among key stakeholders. His confident facade cracked, revealing the tiniest flickers of vulnerability. Every subtle misstep, every hesitation, was catalogued, analyzed, and remembered. Langston, too, was beginning to confront the invisible pressure I had placed on him. Friends and colleagues, subtly influenced by my carefully guided conversations, began to question his decisions, not overtly but in ways he could sense and feel. The invisible weight of doubt was growing heavier, and I watched it accumulate with quiet satisfaction. Night fell, and the estate was quiet once again. I walked the frosted garden paths, tracing the soft moonlight across the snow-dusted hedges. Every small victory, every subtle manipulation, felt like a step closer to the inevitable culmination of strategy. The family that had discarded me, humiliated me, and underestimated my intelligence was beginning to unravel quietly, inexorably, under the weight of perception, influence, and invisible orchestration. Claudia joined me in the gardens, her presence serene. "You have done well," she said. "Tomorrow, the ripple effects will accelerate. Small actions will compound, and the first undeniable shocks will become visible. Patience has yielded opportunity. The storm is approaching its first peak." I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The memory of that Christmas Eve, the cold, the humiliation, the feeling of being discarded, surfaced briefly, but it no longer carried pain. It was fuel sharpened into precision and strategy. Each subtle action over the past days had been designed to exploit their hubris, to reveal vulnerabilities, and to set the stage for the first undeniable consequences. As I returned to my suite, I reviewed my notes, recalibrated sequences, and visualized outcomes. Each ripple of influence was documented, analyzed, and prepared for amplification. The next phase would be more visible, more public, and more undeniable. It would be the first moment my family realized that their assumptions of control were false, and that they had underestimated me entirely. The storm I had patiently nurtured over weeks was ready to make its first significant impact. The subtle cracks had widened into fractures, the invisible pressure had begun to manifest as doubt and hesitation, and the carefully orchestrated manipulations were converging toward visible consequences. Elia Vance was no longer powerless. She was a strategist, an observer, and the orchestrator of an inevitable reckoning. And the first visible waves of consequence were about to hit the family who had thought they had discarded her forever. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the frost glittering like broken diamonds across the meticulously manicured lawns. I stood at the window, watching Viva fumble through her morning routine. A minor wardrobe mishap, a snapped button on her blouse, was exaggerated in her own mind into a crisis. Her carefully curated image was already showing fissures, and I could see her internal panic reflected in the way she flitted from mirror to mirror. Claudia appeared silently beside me. "Observe her reactions," she murmured. "Notice how even minor imperfections unsettle the illusion she projects. These moments compound." It was astonishing, almost poetic, how the small cracks were beginning to reveal the enormous cracks beneath. I sipped my coffee slowly, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of watching her unravel without interference. The more she tried to control perception, the more evident the subtle flaws became. Every micro-expression, a twitch of the lip, a frown that lingered too long, a glance darting toward her phone, was a signal, and I catalogued each one meticulously. By mid-morning, Darius was dealing with the first real consequences of overconfidence. A carefully planted rumor regarding a minor misstep in his business dealings, originating from contacts I had cultivated days earlier, had reached key investors. Their cautious questions and veiled doubts forced him to stumble in his explanations, his normally smooth charm faltering under scrutiny. I noticed the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand as he refilled his glass, the fleeting look of disbelief in his eyes when a polite investor raised a concern he hadn't anticipated. Langston was not immune. I had arranged for an informal discussion about estate investments with an associate he respected. The conversation, seemingly casual, highlighted minor inconsistencies in his recent decisions. Subtle questions and gentle challenges placed him on the defensive without overt confrontation. For the first time in years, I could see genuine hesitation flicker across his face, a brief lapse in his otherwise unshakable confidence. Claudia's whisper reached me again. "They are bending under invisible pressure. The subtlety of perception is your strongest weapon. Allow it to compound naturally." I smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. Their arrogance had been their undoing. They assumed control, assumed competence, and assumed my weakness. Each misstep, each crack in their carefully maintained facades, was proof that perception, when manipulated with precision, could become as powerful as reality itself. By afternoon, Viva's social circle began to amplify the consequences of her earlier missteps. An overlooked invitation, paired with subtle conversations I had guided over the past week, caused whispers among influential peers. The ripple effect was quiet but devastating. Minor doubt, polite reassessment, and the beginnings of isolation from the networks she had long relied upon for social validation. Her polite laughter barely masked the tension as she tried to regain control. Darius, meanwhile, was facing subtle but undeniable consequences in his professional realm. Investors' doubts, minor but persistent, began to accumulate, forcing him to explain and defend decisions he had previously presented as flawless. Every clarification added weight to his visible anxiety. Every question highlighted a tiny gap in his armor. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the seeds I had planted began to bloom into tangible effects. Langston's evening unfolded with similar precision. Casual conversations with long-standing acquaintances, friends who respected his authority, gradually revealed minor oversights in his judgment. Each revelation was subtle, easily dismissed if viewed individually, but collectively they formed a pattern of imperfection he could not ignore. The invisible pressure I had orchestrated had begun to manifest, reshaping perception without overt interference. Returning to my suite, I reviewed the outcomes of the day in meticulous detail. Each ripple of influence, every hesitation, every subtle crack in their facade had been noted and catalogued. The stage was set for the next phase, amplification. The minor cracks that had begun to form over the past weeks would now grow into undeniable fissures, forcing the family to confront the reality they had long assumed they controlled. Claudia appeared beside me once more, her presence calm and unwavering. "You are ready," she said softly. "The first visible shocks are beginning. The subtle ripples will now evolve into undeniable consequences. Patience has brought opportunity. Execution will bring clarity." I exhaled slowly, feeling the quiet thrill of strategy coming to fruition. The humiliation of Christmas Eve, the cold, the despair, they were no longer sources of pain but tools of precision. Each carefully orchestrated interaction, each subtle manipulation of perception, had been designed to achieve a singular purpose: the revelation of truth, the exposure of arrogance, and the creation of consequences that could not be ignored. Night fell, casting long shadows across the estate. The black BMWs gleamed faintly under strategically placed lights, silent reminders of the reach and resources now at my disposal. I walked the gardens alone, imagining the cascade of effects that would unfold in the coming days. The storm I had nurtured was ready to make its presence undeniable. Elia Vance was no longer the powerless daughter discarded on Christmas Eve. She was the strategist, the observer, and the orchestrator of a reckoning that had been long overdue. And with every subtle movement, every carefully timed interaction, the family who had once believed they held all the power was beginning to realize that they had underestimated her entirely. The first waves of consequence were just beginning, and when the full force of strategic, calculated exposure struck, the family would see, with crystal clarity, that the powerless daughter they had discarded was now in complete control. The morning light filtered softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the mansion, illuminating the frost-laced gardens outside. Inside, the atmosphere was deceptively calm. Viva moved through the house like a cat on a hot tin roof, her steps quick, her eyes darting constantly toward her phone. I could hear her forced laughter during a phone call, the subtle tightening of her jaw betraying the growing unease. Claudia appeared quietly in the doorway, her presence commanding but unintrusive. "Observe the fractures. They grow faster than anticipated. Today, the subtle becomes visible," she whispered. Her words had a rhythm, almost hypnotic. "Now, let's escalate." I knew the plan. Today would be the first public manifestation of their unraveling. The minor slips, the whispered doubts, and the quiet misjudgments would now be amplified. No longer were these cracks private. The world would begin to see the consequences of their arrogance. Viva had a luncheon scheduled with several key figures in her social network. I had orchestrated the guest list carefully, ensuring that individuals influenced by the subtle seeds I had planted were present. As she entered, radiant in a dress that once commanded attention effortlessly, I observed the subtle signs of stress, the micro-frowns, the forced smile, the rapid tap of her fingers on the table. The conversation began smoothly, but I could see the ripple forming. One of the women, guided by the gentle nudges I had provided earlier, asked a seemingly innocuous question about Viva's recent charity work. A minor misstatement, carefully documented and shared, forced Viva to backtrack awkwardly. Eyes widened, polite chuckles followed, and I saw the subtle shift in attention, from Viva to the room, then to me, observing quietly. Viva's discomfort grew exponentially with each question. Her carefully constructed persona of effortless elegance began to crumble in front of the very network that had once elevated her. Each hesitation, each correction, added weight to the perception that she was no longer infallible. I kept my expression neutral, sipping my coffee and cataloging every movement, every flicker of tension, every subtle glance of concern she cast toward me. Meanwhile, Darius faced the consequences of professional overreach. The minor rumor I had seeded regarding a questionable business decision had reached investors just before his morning pitch. The hesitation in their questions, the veiled concern, forced Darius into explanations he had not fully rehearsed. I watched from the back of the room as his confident facade wavered, hand movements becoming abrupt, voice slightly sharper, eyes betraying the brief panic that he tried desperately to mask. Every subtle misstep was a victory, every flinch a signal that my strategy was unfolding exactly as planned. Langston was not immune. During a casual dinner with a few associates he believed loyal and supportive, I subtly influenced the conversation to highlight minor inconsistencies in his recent decisions. The innocuous questions, framed with respect and curiosity, forced him to over-explain, exposing gaps in judgment that had never been evident before. A bead of sweat on his temple, a hand gripping the edge of the table, a slight narrowing of the eyes. These micro-reactions told me all I needed to know. The once unassailable patriarch was beginning to bend under invisible pressure. By late afternoon, the family's collective tension had become palpable. Viva's social miscalculations had circulated quietly, amplified by the whispers and polite reassessments of her peers. Darius investors were now quietly questioning his judgment, sharing concerns in hushed tones that nonetheless carried weight. Langston's associates were subtly revising their assessments, questioning minor but cumulative decisions that had previously gone unquestioned. I observed it all, heart steady, mind calculating. The invisible web I had woven was beginning to manifest in visible cracks. No confrontation had occurred, no overt attacks had been launched. Yet, the consequences were undeniable. The family that had discarded me, humiliated me, and assumed control was now experiencing the first public manifestations of vulnerability. Consequences they could neither ignore nor explain. Claudia's soft voice reached me once more. You have orchestrated the invisible with precision. Today, the first wave of undeniable consequence has arrived. Tomorrow, amplification begins. The fractures will become undeniable. That evening, as I walked through the frost-covered gardens, I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. The memory of that Christmas Eve, the cold, the humiliation, the discarded suitcase, surfaced briefly. But it no longer brought pain. Instead, it fueled a sense of clarity, precision, and purpose. Each subtle manipulation, every carefully timed interaction, had been a step toward this moment, the beginning of visible reckoning. I paused by the fountain, watching the moonlight glint off frozen water. The storm I had nurtured over weeks was now making itself known. The subtle ripples had become visible waves, and the family's fragile facade was beginning to show undeniable cracks. Viva's perfectionism, Darius' overconfidence, and Langston's arrogance, all were now vulnerable to exposure. Elia Vance, once the powerless daughter discarded on Christmas Eve, was no longer defined by weakness. She was the strategist, the observer, and the orchestrator of an inevitable reckoning. And as the first visible consequences began to take shape, I felt the quiet thrill of inevitability. The family had underestimated me, just as they always had. And now the world was beginning to notice, one subtle but undeniable ripple at a time. The following morning, the estate was already vibrating with tension, though nothing seemed overt at first glance. Staff moved quietly but with barely restrained whispers. Even the air seemed charged with unspoken anticipation. I walked through the halls with calm purpose, coffee in hand, observing every detail. Every glance from Viva, every subtle shift in Darius' posture, and every carefully measured word from Langston confirmed that the initial ripples of consequence were already widening into waves. Claudia's presence, ever subtle yet undeniably potent, lingered behind me like a shadow of strategy. Today, she whispered, we amplify. Today, the consequences become unavoidable, public, undeniable. Viva had a dinner engagement that evening, an exclusive, invite-only event where appearances mattered as much as substance. I knew she had been relying on the perceived perfection of her social persona, her flawless public image. But I had already planted the seeds of doubt with several influential guests, crafting subtle scenarios where her minor missteps would be noticed and magnified. The afternoon dragged as I monitored her interactions through subtle channels. A strategically positioned window, conversations with staff trained to relay details, and gentle nudges I had orchestrated weeks prior. Each micro-failure she experienced, her phone battery dying at the wrong moment, a cufflink missing, an accidental smudge on her makeup, was magnified silently through the network I had cultivated. By the time she arrived at the event, a small but undeniable cloud of doubt had begun to circle her. Darius, meanwhile, was navigating an already tense boardroom situation. Investors, previously influenced by subtle rumors, began probing deeper into his past decisions, each question carefully designed to expose the tiniest vulnerabilities. The combination of public scrutiny and private hesitation created a perfect storm of anxiety, and I could see him faltering. His polished speech wavered, gestures became erratic, and eyes darted nervously across the room. By the end of the meeting, the room was filled with polite, measured reassessment. Unspoken, yet deeply felt, Darius' aura of control had been fractured. Langston, too, began to feel the pressure of the invisible web I had constructed. Longtime associates, friends he assumed loyal, began raising doubts about his judgment, citing minor miscalculations that had previously gone unnoticed. Each polite question, each cautious suggestion, chipped away at the veneer of authority he projected. I watched quietly as his carefully maintained composure began to quiver, hands gripping the armrests slightly tighter, jaw set with effort, eyes flicking toward the floor as he considered his next move. By mid-afternoon, the first undeniable public consequences were emerging. Rumors, subtly guided, had begun circulating among Viva's social circle, forcing polite reassessment of her previously unquestioned social standing. The whispers of doubt that I had planted weeks ago now found fertile ground, and small missteps were magnified into conversations that could not be ignored. Claudia's voice, soft and steady, guided me through the observations. You see the pattern. Minor cracks now become undeniable. They cannot be dismissed. They're exposed. Let it unfold naturally. Observe the first wave of visible consequences. I watched the unfolding drama with meticulous attention. Viva's attempts to regain control only drew more attention to her vulnerabilities. Darius' attempts to maintain confidence faltered under scrutiny, every minor misstatement a visible flinch. Langston's authority, long unshakable, was visibly eroding, his associates now questioning the same decisions he had confidently defended for years. By evening, the crescendo of subtle chaos had reached its first peak. Guests at Viva's dinner subtly shifted their attention away from her. Polite reassessments floating through whispered conversation and fleeting glances. Darius' investors began quietly discussing the implications of his decisions, eyes flicking toward him with curiosity and measured doubt. Langston, facing his peers, had moments of hesitation so brief, yet telling that even Claudia's trained eye noted the subtle but undeniable cracks. I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection, walking through the frost-coated gardens. The memory of that Christmas Eve, the humiliation, the cold, the feeling of being discarded, surfaced briefly, but it no longer carried pain. It had been transmuted into precision, into strategy, into opportunity. Every subtle action, every carefully orchestrated interaction, was building toward the inevitable reckoning. The night deepened, and the mansion was quiet once more, the tension within its walls palpable. The invisible pressure I had applied was beginning to manifest in undeniable ways. I could almost feel the cumulative weight of minor doubts, missteps, and social recalibrations pressing against the family's facade. Claudia appeared beside me, her presence a silent affirmation. You have orchestrated the initial consequences with mastery. Tomorrow, the amplification continues. The next phase will force them to confront reality in ways they never anticipated. Observe and prepare for escalation. I felt a quiet thrill at the thought. The first wave of consequences had been subtle yet unmistakable. The family was beginning to see the effects of underestimating me. The careful manipulation of perception, the strategic nudges, and the invisible orchestration had all converged to this moment. And yet, this was only the beginning. Elia Vance, once powerless and discarded, was now in motion. The storm of strategy, patience, and precision was gathering momentum. The family's arrogance, once so impenetrable, was beginning to crumble under the invisible weight of exposure. And as the first undeniable consequences continued to unfold, the foundation of their carefully constructed lives was shifting, quietly, inexorably, and with precision. Tomorrow promised greater amplification, larger stakes, and the first moments where public perception would intersect with private vulnerability. The subtle manipulations were ready to converge into undeniable revelations. The family would soon understand, with shock and disbelief, that the powerless daughter they had thrown out was no longer powerless at all. The next morning arrived with a biting chill, the kind that made even the golden estate gates seem unwelcoming. I stood in the sunroom, observing the frost-covered landscape, the mansion quiet but vibrating with anticipation. The subtle consequences of the previous day had begun to ripple outward, reaching beyond the walls of the estate, and I felt the thrill of impending escalation. Claudia's presence was calm but insistent. Today, the exposure becomes public. They will begin to see, in ways they cannot ignore, the cracks they have been trying to conceal. Your role is to observe, to allow the strategy to unfold, and to be ready for amplification at the first opportunity. Viva's schedule was the first point of escalation. She was attending a high-profile charity gala that evening, one she had relied on to cement her social dominance. I had spent weeks subtly planting seeds of doubt among her peers, small, almost invisible interactions that would be noticed by those who mattered most. By the time she arrived, her perfect persona had already been questioned quietly in advance. At the gala, the effects were immediate. Guests whispered under their breath, casting fleeting glances at her, the murmurs subtle but unmistakable. I watched as her polished smile faltered for a split second, that micro-expression betraying the unease I had been waiting to observe. Each time she tried to command attention, a subtle interruption, a glance away, a whispered comment, undermined her authority without anyone needing to overtly challenge her. Meanwhile, Darius faced an even more acute form of scrutiny. The minor missteps I had seeded in his professional life were now converging with deliberate reminders to his network. Investors, previously hesitant, began asking pointed questions that exposed weaknesses in his plans. His normally confident answers now sounded rehearsed, forced, and thin. I could see the subtle twitch of his fingers, the almost imperceptible rise in his voice pitch, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he struggled to maintain composure. Langston's veneer of control also began to crack under scrutiny. Casual conversations with old friends and associates, subtly guided by information I had leaked in small doses over the past month, now forced him into explanations he had not prepared for. Each answer revealed a minor inconsistency, a decision that seemed impulsive or flawed, and I could see the weight of recognition pressing on him. For the first time, he was genuinely unsettled, the patriarchal armor he had always worn showing dents and scratches in the subtle, unavoidable light of scrutiny. By late afternoon, the initial cracks had begun to widen, forming visible fissures in the family's carefully maintained image. Social networks, professional circles, and private associates all began to recognize patterns of inconsistency, mistakes, and vulnerability. The once invincible facade of perfection was starting to crumble. I took a moment to reflect, standing alone in the frost-covered garden. The memory of that Christmas Eve, the suitcase, the cold, the sharp sting of betrayal, surfaced briefly, but it no longer caused pain. Instead, it fueled clarity and purpose. The humiliation had become a tool, the rejection a strategy, and every carefully orchestrated interaction a step toward inevitable reckoning. Claudia's whisper cut through my thoughts. Notice the reactions. They are beginning to realize that control is slipping. Allow the amplification to continue naturally. The public exposure will accelerate their unraveling. The evening gala was the perfect crucible. Viva's missteps, small yet cumulative, became the subject of hushed conversation among attendees. Darius' hesitation in boardroom-like discussions at the gala revealed cracks in his confidence. Langston's occasional stammer, minor though it was, highlighted flaws that had previously gone unnoticed. Every carefully observed reaction fed into the next phase of the plan. Undeniable, public exposure of the arrogance and entitlement that had once seemed untouchable. As I watched from a discreet corner, the thrill of inevitability settled in my chest. Each ripple I had created, each subtle nudge, was converging into a wave of undeniable consequences. The family, once confident in their dominance, was beginning to experience the weight of invisible strategy, the pressure of consequences they could neither ignore nor immediately comprehend. By the time the gala concluded, the social perception of the family had shifted. Small comments, whispered doubts, and fleeting glances had accumulated into an invisible tide, eroding the carefully maintained image of perfection. Viva's forced smiles no longer concealed the tension. Darius' polished confidence faltered in private conversations. Langston's authority felt subtly undermined even among allies. Back at the estate, the night air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of frost and distant pine. I walked through the gardens, reflecting on the progression of events. The strategy was unfolding as intended, subtle, invisible manipulations transforming into undeniable public consequences. Each micro-event, each whispered doubt, each fleeting glance contributed to a growing realization among the family. The daughter they had discarded was no longer powerless, and the consequences of underestimating her were now unavoidable. Claudia's final words of the night were calm, but filled with quiet authority. You have orchestrated the public exposure with precision. Tomorrow, the final stage begins, the phase where consequences intersect with perception, forcing undeniable acknowledgement of their misjudgment. Prepare for the moment when strategy meets visibility. Your patience and calculation will be rewarded. I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. The family's arrogance, once untouchable, was now a fragile facade cracking under subtle, deliberate pressure. Each exposure, each reaction, each whispered acknowledgement of doubt had been meticulously guided to converge at this very moment. And as the frost glimmered across the estate, I realized that the storm of strategic revenge was approaching its crescendo. Elia Vance, once discarded on a Christmas Eve, was now poised on the edge of undeniable revelation. The groundwork had been laid, the consequences had begun to manifest publicly, and the family would soon confront the truth. The powerless daughter they had dismissed was now in complete control of the narrative, the perception, and the inevitable reckoning that was about to follow. The following morning, the estate felt different. Even the walls seemed to vibrate with an unspoken tension, a subtle energy that hadn't existed before. Staff moved quietly but deliberately, whispers barely restrained as they carried the undercurrent of anticipation. I walked through the halls with measured calm, observing every detail. The way Viva's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her outfit, the barely perceptible frown on Darius' face, the faint crease in Langston's brow. All were signs that the first wave of consequences had begun to bite. Claudia appeared in the doorway, her presence commanding without being intrusive. "Today," she said softly, "the invisible becomes visible. The cracks are no longer subtle. Every action, every glance, every decision will reinforce the narrative you've created. They will see themselves as the world sees them, and it will not be flattering." Viva's day began with an unexpected complication. I had arranged for several social invitations she assumed were endorsements to subtly shift in tone. An influential guest, guided carefully by my prior interactions, questioned the accuracy of her charitable claims. The question was innocent to the untrained ear, but perfectly designed to force hesitation. Her smile faltered, the inflection of her voice wavered, and for the first time in years, the unflappable social queen felt the sting of doubt. Meanwhile, Darius was facing his own challenges. A minor leak of strategic miscalculations I had orchestrated weeks ago had reached the media. Subtle enough to appear like rumor at first, but now it was tangible, quoted in small business blogs with hints of skepticism. Each article, each social media post, chipped away at the carefully curated image of competence he had worked so hard to project. I watched from a distance as he struggled to respond, his gestures slightly erratic, his voice betraying frustration as he navigated a network increasingly aware of his flaws. Langston, too, began to experience the weight of public scrutiny. Associates he had long considered loyal began asking pointed questions during casual interactions, referencing minor inconsistencies in his previous decisions. The cracks, which had been invisible and private, were now visible in subtle but undeniable ways. His composure wavered briefly, a tight jawline betraying tension, eyes flicking toward the floor as he considered the ramifications. By mid-afternoon, the subtle pressures I had set in motion were converging into a tangible, almost visible force. Viva's social circle had begun to circulate whispers of doubt, each micro-failure magnified by perception and commentary. Darius' professional credibility wavered as investors quietly reassessed, and Langston's authority appeared less secure as associates compared notes. The invisible web I had spun was now asserting itself in the tangible world, and the family's carefully maintained facades were beginning to crumble. I stood on the balcony overlooking the estate gardens, watching the frost glisten under the pale winter sun. Memories of that fateful Christmas Eve, the cold, the humiliation, the suitcase abandoned on the marble steps, surfaced briefly, but I felt no pain. Instead, the recollection fueled clarity and purpose. Every interaction, every subtle manipulation, every carefully orchestrated nudge was converging toward undeniable consequences. Claudia's voice reached me once more, low and measured. "Observe carefully. The first phase of public exposure has begun. Tomorrow, amplification continues. The family will confront the truth of their miscalculations, and they will do so publicly. Prepare to witness the results of patience and precision." That evening, the family gathered in the main dining room for what they assumed would be a routine dinner. But subtle changes were already evident. Viva's usual dominance in conversation was disrupted by whispers she couldn't ignore. Darius' attempts at smooth dialogue faltered under the weight of freshly circulated rumors. Langston's composure, though impressive, could not entirely mask the tension in the room. I entered quietly, observing. Each subtle glance, each careful word, each forced smile was a sign of the cracks expanding. The household that had discarded me, humiliated me, and assumed control was now beginning to experience the consequences of arrogance and underestimation. Claudia's presence beside me was a silent reassurance. You've orchestrated the initial consequences beautifully. Observe and allow the next stage to unfold. The perception of power and control is shifting. Their response will be revealing. As the night deepened, small but undeniable moments of exposure continued. A fleeting comment, a misstep in etiquette, a hesitation in speech. Each added weight to the growing perception that the family's previously unassailable status was not as secure as they believed. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that control had subtly but irrevocably shifted. I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection in the garden afterward, watching the frost shimmer under the moonlight. The invisible forces I had set in motion were now tangible. The first public consequences were visible, undeniable, and irreversible. The family's arrogance, once untouchable, was now subject to scrutiny and judgment, both subtle and overt. Elia Vance, once powerless and discarded, had now become the quiet force orchestrating an unstoppable reckoning. The stage was set. The public exposure had begun. And with each subtle but undeniable consequence, the family would inch closer to the moment where the full weight of their underestimation would come crashing down. The frost-covered gardens, silent under the winter moon, were a testament to patience, precision, and inevitable justice. Tomorrow, the amplification would continue, and the family's fragile facade would face the undeniable truth. The daughter they had thrown away was no longer powerless, and the reckoning they had ignored for so long was finally arriving. The morning broke crisp and cold, frost still clinging stubbornly to the edges of the estate's marble steps. I could see my reflection in the still glimmering windows, calm, composed, but beneath that, a quiet excitement simmered. Today would mark the next phase, the stage where subtle exposure collided with undeniable public reality. The first waves of consequences had been felt privately. Now, it was time to let them ripple outward in ways the family couldn't ignore. Claudia entered the sunlit room, her presence deliberate, unyielding. "Today," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you begin to intersect perception with consequence. Their vulnerabilities, once invisible, will now be undeniable in the eyes of those they value most. Watch, learn, and strike when the opportunity presents itself." I had prepared for this moment meticulously. Social circles, professional networks, and even casual acquaintances had been primed over the past month to notice, to comment, and to challenge the narratives that Viva, Darius, and Langston relied on. Everything had been orchestrated so that each subtle misstep, each flaw, would not remain isolated. It would resonate publicly. Viva was the first to encounter the amplified consequences. She had planned a brunch with high-profile friends who were, unbeknownst to her, subtly influenced by the whispers I had planted. One by one, their questions began innocently enough, testing her knowledge of philanthropic initiatives, probing her recent social posts. But each question, perfectly calibrated, revealed small inconsistencies. Her practiced smiles faltered. She laughed at the wrong moment. A minor detail, previously unnoticed, drew attention, and suddenly the room's energy shifted. The micro-moments I had seeded became magnified as conversation flowed. A compliment turned backhanded. A fleeting comment became a pointed observation. Her friends, conditioned subtly over time, began to respond with hesitation and doubt. The room's energy, once comfortably in her favor, became brittle, tense. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, a motion so small yet so revealing. Her carefully curated aura of perfection was cracking. Meanwhile, Darius faced a similar subtle dismantling. The leaks I had seeded in industry blogs and private discussions reached investors who were attending overlapping events. Questions that seemed casual on the surface now carried weight, drawing attention to decisions that previously had gone unexamined. His attempts to respond smoothly faltered. I could see the tension creeping into his gestures, an abrupt movement of a hand, a tightening of his jaw, eyes that flicked too quickly from face to face. He was no longer commanding confidence. He was responding defensively, forced to justify himself to an audience primed to notice imperfections. Langston, the unshakable patriarch, experienced an equally subtle yet devastating shift. I had arranged for long-trusted colleagues to ask seemingly innocuous questions about past investments and philanthropic choices. Minor inconsistencies, carefully highlighted, became impossible to dismiss. The cracks in his authority, previously invisible behind years of experience and presence, were now palpable. Even his usual calm, measured responses betrayed brief moments of hesitation. The foundation of unquestioned respect that had been his shield began to erode under invisible pressure. As the day unfolded, the invisible orchestrations converged. Each subtle observation, each whispered doubt, each fleeting hesitation was a thread weaving a tapestry of undeniable consequences. By mid-afternoon, the estate itself seemed to vibrate with tension. Staff moved quietly, aware of the subtle shift in dynamics. Guests and acquaintances reacted to micro-moments with heightened attention. The family's carefully maintained image of control and perfection was becoming a fragile illusion, cracking under pressure in ways they could neither ignore nor conceal. I took a brief walk through the frost-lined gardens, reflecting on the strategic orchestration of events. The memory of that Christmas Eve, the cold, the humiliation, the feeling of being discarded, surfaced briefly. But it no longer caused pain. Instead, it fueled clarity, focus, and an exhilarating sense of purpose. Each interaction, each carefully timed intervention, each subtle manipulation was converging toward undeniable consequences. Claudia appeared beside me, a silent reminder of the stakes. Observe their reactions. They are beginning to recognize the shift. The invisible influence has become undeniable reality. Soon, the next phase will present itself. The phase where visibility forces acknowledgement and accountability. The evening brought a turning point. Viva attended a private gathering of socialites, an event she had assumed would reinforce her dominance. Instead, the seeds I had planted bore fruit. Guests questioned her credibility, pointed out minor inconsistencies, and subtly undermined her previously unquestionable authority. Her carefully constructed confidence faltered, revealing glimpses of the insecurity I had long suspected. I could see it in the slight shaking of her hands, the faltering of her smile, the rapid blinking as she processed each comment. Simultaneously, Darius investors confronted him with pointed questions. Minor missteps in previous ventures, which had been strategically leaked, were now public fodder. His usual eloquence wavered. Gestures became erratic. Even a hint of defensiveness betrayed him. What had once seemed like minor reputational risks were now material, undeniable, and public. Langston, though composed, was not immune. Associates began probing past decisions, exposing inconsistencies I had highlighted. The subtle cracks in his authority were now noticeable to all who had once deferred to him unquestioningly. The patriarchal image he projected, long considered unshakable, was now fractured, each minor flaw magnified in social perception. By nightfall, the family's carefully maintained facade was visibly crumbling. Micro-moments, whispered doubts, and public scrutiny converged to create a tangible sense of instability. The invisible forces I had orchestrated were now manifest, and the family could no longer ignore the consequences of their past arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty. Standing in the frost-covered gardens, I felt the first wave of triumph, not vindictive but precise, earned, and inevitable. The family was beginning to see, in subtle but undeniable ways, the reality of their misjudgment. The invisible strategy one had crafted over weeks was now tangible, and the stage was set for the final phase. The moment where consequences would collide with perception and undeniable reckoning would be inescapable. Claudia's quiet voice, always measured, resonated in the night air. You have orchestrated the public exposure with precision. Tomorrow, the final phase begins, the phase where the invisible becomes inescapable, and the full weight of acknowledgement falls upon them. Observe and prepare. The frost sparkled beneath the moonlight as I walked through the garden, every breath visible in the cold night. Elia Vance, once discarded and powerless, was now a quiet force of strategy, patience, and calculated inevitability. The family would soon confront the truth. The daughter they had thrown away was no longer powerless, and the reckoning, both public and personal, was about to arrive. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying a quiet tension that even the frost seemed to sense. I had been up before dawn, walking the estate grounds, watching the pale light stretch across frost-laced gardens and frozen fountains. Today was not about whispers or subtle doubt. Today was about visibility, forcing the family to confront the consequences of their arrogance and cruelty head-on. Claudia appeared beside me, her silhouette framed by the early light. Today, she said, the culmination begins. What was invisible becomes undeniable. Every carefully orchestrated move leads to this moment. They will see, clearly and publicly, the results of their choices. Observe closely. Timing is everything. By mid-morning, the stage was set. The family had scheduled a brunch for close friends, business associates, and influential socialites, a gathering they assumed would reinforce their status. But I had subtly rearranged the social landscape over weeks. Every guest, every associate, had been primed to notice what they previously overlooked. Each interaction, each comment, each glance would serve as a mirror reflecting the cracks in the family's carefully curated facade. Viva arrived first, her red silk dress almost blinding in its perfection. But the confidence she wore so easily the day before was now brittle. A few subtle nods from key guests, a whispered remark here or there, made her glance up sharply, seeking affirmation she would not receive. The room, once a stage for her dominance, now subtly resisted her. She hesitated over introductions, laughed at the wrong moments, and for the first time in years, the queen of social grace felt out of rhythm. Darius, too, faced mounting pressure. Investors and colleagues, carefully nudged over the past weeks, began asking pointed questions. The questions were gentle, almost casual, but precise, small cracks that demanded immediate answers. His attempts to respond with smooth confidence faltered. Gestures were jerky, phrases stumbled over, and even a hint of defensiveness slipped into his tone. Micro-expressions betrayed irritation and insecurity. Langston's authority, though outwardly composed, was visibly strained. Associates asked pointed questions about minor decisions and inconsistencies, which had been subtly highlighted over the past month. Each inquiry forced a mental gymnastics he hadn't anticipated. Even his measured calm seemed to flicker, like a candle fighting a sudden draft. The patriarchal armor that had always protected him was beginning to chip under the weight of scrutiny. I observed from the periphery, silently noting every reaction. The brunch, meant to showcase perfection and control, had instead become a stage for subtle unraveling. Each carefully timed glance, whispered comment, and hesitant smile contributed to an environment where perception and reality began to intersect in unavoidable ways. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere was tense, electric with the silent realization that nothing was as unassailable as it seemed. Viva's movements had become cautious, Darius' responses increasingly calculated, and Langston's posture slightly more rigid. Every subtle misstep was magnified by observation, creating a feedback loop that intensified the pressure. Then came the pivotal moment. A conversation between Viva and one of her longtime social allies took a sudden turn. A gentle probing question about her charitable endeavors revealed discrepancies that had been strategically seeded. Her response, though rehearsed, faltered. Eyes widened subtly, glances exchanged across the table. The energy shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Simultaneously, Darius' group faced a similar pressure test. An investor, previously briefed and guided, asked a seemingly casual question about past funding rounds. The question exposed a minor oversight I had orchestrated months earlier. His hesitation, though brief, was enough to plant doubt in the minds of the room. Each subtle gesture, a tightening of a jaw, a quick glance, a momentary pause, was observed and noted by those who mattered most. Langston, seated at the head of the table, felt the weight of perception pressing in. Colleagues and friends asked questions that required explanations he had not fully prepared for, subtly highlighting inconsistencies that had previously gone unnoticed. The tension in his posture, the flicker in his eyes, and the minute changes in tone all signaled the first cracks in the armor of his authority. I could feel the quiet thrill of inevitability. The carefully crafted invisible forces were now fully manifest in the visible world. Each ripple, each whisper, each micro-expression was converging toward a singular truth. The family's control was no longer unchallenged, and the daughter they had discarded was now orchestrating the undeniable consequences. By the time the brunch concluded, the atmosphere was unmistakable. The family's facade of dominance had shifted. Subtle but undeniable, the perception of authority and perfection had been recalibrated by careful observation and strategic intervention. Guests left with an impression that contradicted the image the family had cultivated for years. A quiet acknowledgement that perfection had been, at best, aspirational, and at worst, fragile. That evening, I walked through the frost-covered gardens, reflecting on the day's events. Each small victory, each subtle exposure, had been precise, deliberate, and unavoidable. The invisible orchestration had intersected with reality, creating a convergence of perception and consequence. The family, once untouchable in their arrogance, was beginning to confront the truth in ways they could neither ignore nor reverse. Claudia's presence beside me was calm but commanding. "Observe carefully," she said. Today, the invisible has become undeniable. Tomorrow, the amplification continues. Their acknowledgement, forced by public perception and private realization, will be complete. Patience and precision have brought you to this point. The final phase approaches. I stood alone under the pale moonlight, the frost sparkling beneath my feet, and felt the quiet satisfaction of strategy realized. Elia Vance, once powerless and discarded, was now the architect of undeniable consequences. The family's arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty had been exposed through subtle, relentless pressure and the moment of reckoning. The public and personal acknowledgement of their misjudgment was imminent. The frost glistened, silent and unyielding. Tomorrow, the final phase would unfold. The family would face the undeniable reality. The daughter they had thrown away was no longer powerless, and the reckoning they had ignored for so long was about to arrive. The dawn broke pale and gray, shivering through the frost-laden estate gardens. There was a charged silence in the air, the kind that prickles your skin and tightens your chest. Today was different. Today, the subtle manipulations, whispers, and carefully placed nudges were no longer enough. Today, the reckoning would be unavoidable. Claudia arrived with her usual quiet authority, her eyes scanning the estate with an almost imperceptible smile. This is the day where perception meets undeniable truth. They will see everything, they cannot avoid it. Every step they take today will reinforce the reality they have ignored for so long. I had prepared meticulously. The gathering in the main hall would not be a casual brunch or a polite social event. No, this would be the stage where their flaws, arrogance, and entitlement collided with truth under the gaze of everyone who mattered. Every influential guest had been carefully briefed, every minor detail orchestrated, every conversation subtly guided. This was no longer subtle, it was precise, inescapable exposure. Viva arrived first, radiant in silk and diamonds, yet the moment she stepped into the hall, the shift was palpable. Eyes that had previously admired her now lingered with subtle scrutiny. Guests began asking questions that seemed casual, but were designed to highlight inconsistencies and small hypocrisies. Each inquiry caused her practiced smile to falter. Her laughter, once effortless, now sounded hollow, rehearsed, defensive. She had expected admiration. Instead, she encountered quiet doubt and observation. Darius followed, confident at first, until a series of questions from investors he had long trusted revealed minor discrepancies I had orchestrated weeks prior. Each subtle slip forced him into explanations, revealing cracks in his previously unshakable facade. The gestures, tightened jaw, rapid hand movements, fleeting hesitation, betrayed a tension he could not fully mask. Even his carefully honed charm could not deflect the mounting pressure. Langston, the patriarch, was next. Though outwardly composed, the questions directed his way were subtle, indirect, and impossible to dismiss. Each required a careful mental calculation, and each revealed tiny cracks in decisions and statements he had considered beyond scrutiny. He maintained his composure, but the flicker in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a glass, betrayed the tension beneath the surface. The first overt confrontation came with the softest of whispers, a guest casually referencing a charitable donation that did not align with previous statements, another noting a business oversight, a subtle but visible contradiction in Langston's carefully curated public persona. The room shifted perceptibly. Whispers spread, glances exchanged. The facade of perfection was fracturing. Viva's reactions were the most telling. She attempted to reclaim control, interjecting with rehearsed stories and deflecting questions, but the damage was done. Subtle laughter turned to polite silence, admiration turned to doubt, and confidence became tentative. Each guest's perception was shifting, unavoidably and irreversibly. The social mirror had reflected back her vulnerabilities, and she could not unsee them. Darius' responses grew increasingly defensive. Questions that seemed casual but were strategically placed forced him into reactive stances. Each word, each gesture, each micro-expression further revealed the tension I had anticipated. Investors and colleagues, subtly primed to notice these small cracks, began to share knowing looks. What had once seemed minor, isolated, or inconsequential now appeared as a pattern. Unmistakable, undeniable. Langston, even with years of authority and influence, could not escape. The questions and observations, gently amplified by subtle audience reactions, created a cascade of doubt. Associates who had once deferred unquestioningly now observed critically. Each minor slip, each hesitation, amplified under scrutiny, forced acknowledgement of imperfections previously ignored. His authority, carefully cultivated over decades, was visibly strained. The crescendo approached when one of the family's closest social allies asked a question that cut closer than anyone else dared. It referenced a previously dismissed incident, a small misjudgment that, when seen in context with the subtle revelations over the past weeks, cast the family's integrity in a new light. Viva froze, Darius faltered, Langston's eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. Every carefully constructed defense collapsed under scrutiny. And then I spoke. Not loudly, not arrogantly, but with calm certainty. I think there's been a lot of discussion about perception today. But perception only matters when truth is ignored. And it seems there are truths that have been overlooked for far too long. Every head turned, silence falling like a drawn curtain. My voice, steady, deliberate, carried the weight of someone who had been discarded, overlooked, and dismissed, and who had returned fully in control. Viva's face paled. Darius' eyes widened slightly, the first hint of fear breaking through his carefully maintained confidence. Langston's hand trembled ever so slightly as he gripped his chair. The room, once an environment of casual admiration, had shifted into a crucible of revelation. I continued, letting the truth speak for itself. It's funny how easy it is to assume that power guarantees loyalty, that wealth guarantees respect, and that cruelty guarantees silence. But when the veneer is stripped away, even the smallest inconsistencies become visible, and the foundations crumble. Each word landed with deliberate precision. Guests murmured, some nodding subtly, others exchanging knowing glances. The subtle orchestration of doubt, exposure, and public scrutiny had converged perfectly. Viva opened her mouth, attempting to interject, but her words faltered under the weight of the room's shifted perception. Darius tried to recover, but the cracks were now evident to everyone, including those he had assumed were loyal. Langston, patriarch and authority figure, realized that no measured response could entirely mask the vulnerability now visible to all. And in that room, with the frost of past betrayal still fresh in my memory, I felt a quiet triumph, not of vengeance, but of justice realized. Every strategic move, every subtle exposure, every careful orchestration of perception and truth had culminated in this undeniable moment. The family could no longer ignore the consequences of their arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty. I stepped back, letting the silence linger, the room's energy charged with tension. This was not the end. It was the apex. The public acknowledgement of fault, the visible fracture of arrogance, and the subtle but undeniable shift of power had all been achieved. The family, once untouchable in their pride, was now confronting the reality of underestimation, and the reckoning was inescapable. The frost outside glimmered under the late afternoon sun, a silent witness to the orchestration of patience, strategy, and inevitable justice. Elia Vance, once discarded and powerless, had reclaimed her agency, orchestrating consequences with precision and unyielding clarity. The stage was set for the final phase, full confrontation, undeniable acknowledgement, and the emotional closure that had been years in the making. Evening settled over the estate like a velvet curtain, the long shadows stretching across frost-speckled gardens and manicured lawns. Inside, the family still clung to the remnants of composure, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. Every subtle misstep from earlier in the day had compounded, creating a pressure they could no longer ignore. The stage was set for the final act. I entered the main hall with deliberate calm, my boots clicking softly against polished marble. Claudia was close behind, her eyes scanning for opportunities to guide, to nudge, to ensure the orchestration reached its apex. Today was not about whispers or subtle doubt. It was about undeniable public acknowledgement. The family had gathered for dinner, unaware that this meal would not be a casual showcase of wealth and charm. Every detail had been manipulated. Seating arrangements, conversational cues, carefully placed witnesses. Each element was designed to expose, confront, and ultimately dismantle the illusion of perfection they clung to. Viva's movements were tight, almost robotic. Her smiles, once effortless, were now hesitant, carefully calculated. The lingering glances from earlier in the day had unsettled her deeply, and the murmurs of subtle observation still echoed in her mind. She tried to dominate the conversation, but each attempt was met with polite correction, slight factual reminders, or subtle contradictions. The veneer of superiority she had worn for years was dissolving before the very people she sought to impress. Darius, seated at her side, was equally unsettled. Investors and colleagues subtly questioned past decisions, quietly amplifying inconsistencies I had exposed weeks ago. He attempted to regain control, offering rehearsed justifications and smooth responses, but the cracks in his confidence betrayed him. His gestures grew erratic, and his voice occasionally faltered under scrutiny. For the first time, those who had once deferred unquestioningly to him noticed vulnerability, and it was intoxicating to witness. Langston, the patriarch, remained outwardly composed, but the tension under his skin was visible. Small tremors in his hand, the faint flicker of doubt in his eyes, the slight stiffening of posture. All signs that even he could not entirely shield himself from the consequences of past arrogance and entitlement. Questions were directed subtly, and the answers he offered, though careful, were punctuated by pauses, minor inconsistencies, and defensive undertones. I finally spoke, stepping forward with measured confidence. "There's something I need everyone to understand tonight," I began, letting my voice carry through the room without shouting. "Perception is fragile. It bends easily under scrutiny. And when the foundation you've built on cruelty, entitlement, and disregard is exposed, even subtly, it begins to crack." All eyes turned to me. Viva's face tightened, Darius' jaw clenched, Langston's expression hardened. But each was a mask over an unmistakable flicker of recognition. They knew this wasn't idle commentary. This was deliberate, visible, undeniable. I continued, my tone calm, almost conversational, but every word carried the weight of years of betrayal and exile. For too long, I was discarded, ignored, considered less than. For too long, arrogance and entitlement created the illusion of superiority. But illusions are fragile. And reality doesn't lie. The room was silent, tension humming in the air like an electric current. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes darting between family members, sensing the magnitude of the unfolding confrontation. The subtle orchestration of doubt and exposure had reached full visibility, and the family could no longer hide behind wealth, charm, or authority. Viva's voice trembled slightly as she attempted to interrupt, but the words faltered. "Elia, you don't understand," she began, but the polite, expectant gazes from the guests stifled her. The rehearsal of superiority she had relied on for years was unraveling. Each pause, each halting gesture, exposed vulnerability she could not contain. Darius attempted to intervene, offering reassurances, smoothing over perceived tension. But his words only reinforced the cracks. Subtle probing from investors and colleagues highlighted discrepancies, small missteps, and inconsistencies. His confidence, once unshakable, wavered visibly. For the first time, the people whose respect he had assumed as a birthright noticed his fallibility. Langston, patriarch and symbol of authority, finally spoke, his voice controlled but not entirely free of tension. "Elia, what exactly are you implying?" I let a pause hang in the air, measured, deliberate. Every eye followed mine. The frost of past betrayal, the cold exile, the silent humiliation, they all merged into a single moment. "I'm implying," I said slowly, deliberately, "that the family who discards love, loyalty, and honesty in favor of arrogance and entitlement will eventually confront the truth in the most inescapable way, public acknowledgement of their flaws. And tonight, that truth is undeniable." Viva's hands trembled in her lap. Darius' posture stiffened unnaturally. Langston's gaze flickered between control and realization. Each of them felt, viscerally, the consequences of the past that had been carefully ignored for decades. The room held its collective breath as I let the moment stretch. I had orchestrated every detail to this point. The subtle whispers, the carefully placed witnesses, the indirect exposure that now converged into unavoidable acknowledgement. The family could no longer hide behind facades. Every inconsistency, every act of arrogance, every dismissal of kindness and humanity had been illuminated under scrutiny. Claudia, standing quietly beside me, gave a small, approving nod. Every step, every interaction, every carefully guided moment had built to this apex. The invisible orchestration had become undeniable reality. I continued, softer now, letting the weight of truth resonate. Kindness, loyalty, and integrity aren't commodities to be discarded. They are the foundation of respect. You may have forgotten that once, but tonight, it is impossible to ignore. Viva's eyes welled, Darius' lips pressed thin, and Langston's hands shook slightly. The guests, previously silent, now began to murmur, their acknowledgement reinforcing the shift in energy. The room, once a showcase of dominance, had become a stage for reckoning. A reckoning that was precise, deliberate, and inescapable. I stepped back, allowing the silence to linger. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every unspoken acknowledgement was part of the symphony I had orchestrated. The family, once untouchable in their arrogance and entitlement, was finally facing the undeniable weight of consequence. And in that silence, I felt the first true wave of release, a cathartic, measured, quiet triumph that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with justice realized. The night air had grown heavier, filled with an unspoken acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same. The family, seated around the grand dining table, bore the weight of recognition. Their carefully constructed illusions, polished over decades, had fractured, revealing the raw truth beneath, a truth that no wealth, charm, or entitlement could hide. I moved through the room with calm precision, feeling the power of presence I had once lacked. Each step was deliberate, measured, a reflection of the years of planning, the patience, and the pain that had carried me here. Viva avoided my gaze, fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Darius' eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Langston's jaw tightened, his pride wrestling with the undeniable reality that he had underestimated the daughter he had discarded. Claudia, standing quietly at the edge of the room, whispered softly to me, "Now let them absorb it fully. Let them feel the subtle weight of accountability. This is when understanding truly lands. Not in anger, but in clarity. And clarity is exactly what unfolded." Viva finally spoke, voice trembling, almost pleading. "Elia, I didn't mean for." I held up a hand, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the gravity to settle. "Viva, it's not about what you meant," I said calmly. "It's about what you did. What you and everyone else here did. Actions have consequences, whether you intended them or not." She glanced at the guests as if seeking validation, but found only subtle, questioning eyes. The people who had once deferred to her confidence were now silent observers of accountability. The room, once echoing with casual admiration and silent envy, now vibrated with recognition and reflection. Darius attempted to interject, offering a rehearsed charm, but his voice faltered. The carefully primed questions and strategic observations from earlier guests had worked. His credibility, long assumed as a given, had eroded under subtle scrutiny, and his attempts to reclaim dominance rang hollow. Langston finally met my gaze, his eyes softened, but the pride that had once insulated him from criticism trembled under exposure. "Elia," he began, but no apology followed. Instead, there was the recognition of wrongs, the acknowledgement that the path they had chosen to discard and belittle had created a chasm too deep to ignore. I allowed a small, controlled smile, not of triumph, but of release. "I am not here to humiliate," I said. "I am here to ensure the truth is seen and justice, in its quiet but undeniable form, is recognized. You will carry this with you, an understanding that disregard and cruelty have consequences, that perception is fragile, and integrity cannot be bypassed without reflection." The room held its collective breath. Every subtle gesture, the faltering of hands, the tightening of jaws, the flickers of guilt or shame, was amplified under the quiet weight of the moment. Each acknowledgement, unspoken yet visible, contributed to the emotional culmination of years of pain and strategic precision. After a long pause, Viva finally lowered her gaze. I don't know what to say," she whispered, voice barely audible. "You don't need to say anything," I replied. "Actions, reflection, and acknowledgement are more powerful than words. Let this moment speak for itself. Let it shape the choices you make from here on out." Darius' shoulders slumped slightly, an almost imperceptible surrender of the ego that had long driven him. Langston's posture softened, the tension in his hands releasing fractionally. They had felt clearly and undeniably the consequences of their decisions, the way arrogance and entitlement, when unchecked, inevitably lead to exposure. Claudia stepped forward, her presence quiet yet commanding. "Elia," she said softly, "what you've orchestrated here is not just about confrontation. It's about reclamation. Not vengeance, not punishment, but reclamation of truth and integrity. You have transformed pain into power, exclusion into presence, and betrayal into clarity." I nodded, feeling the weight of years lift subtly from my shoulders. This was not a moment of retribution in the conventional sense. It was a reclamation of dignity, of agency, of recognition. For the first time in decades, the balance had shifted, not through confrontation alone, but through strategic, psychological, and emotional precision. The guests began to rise, some approaching me with quiet congratulations, others simply acknowledging the shift with subtle nods or reflective glances. The atmosphere, once dominated by tension and expectation, now carried a muted, respectful awe. The subtle orchestration of perception, truth, and consequence had achieved its full effect. Viva left the room first, her steps tentative, her usual confidence replaced by a fragile awareness of her own limitations and misjudgments. Darius followed shortly after, silent, contemplative, his ego subdued by the inescapable exposure of flaws previously ignored. Langston remained seated for a moment longer, then stood with a measured grace, perhaps finally internalizing the lessons that had been orchestrated with such precision. I lingered, walking through the quiet halls of the estate, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The frost of betrayal, the cold exile, the years of being dismissed and discarded, all of it had culminated in this moment of clarity and reclamation. I had not sought to humiliate, but to illuminate. I had not sought vengeance, but truth. And in that quiet triumph, I felt a release more profound than any act of retaliation could provide. Claudia, walking beside me, offered a final piece of wisdom. Remember this, Elia. Power without patience is fleeting. Justice without clarity is hollow. But when strategy, truth, and restraint converge, the impact is undeniable and lasting. You have learned this, and so have they. I paused in the grand foyer, looking at the frosted windows and the muted glow of the moon. The estate, once a symbol of exclusion and pain, now felt different. Not mine, not theirs, but a stage for acknowledgement, reflection, and the undeniable presence of truth. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I breathed without hesitation. The ache in my chest, the years of rejection, the weight of being discarded, they had all been transmuted into something lasting: clarity, integrity, and undeniable presence. And as I stepped outside into the cool night, the frost sparkling under the pale moonlight, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a long journey completed. The family, the guests, and even I had been transformed. The reckoning was over, not with fireworks or shouting, but with the subtle, unassailable force of truth made visible and justice delivered in its purest, most enduring form. As I stand here, looking back on everything that happened, I can't help but marvel at how life has a way of delivering justice in forms we least expect. Not every victory is loud, not every triumph comes with applause, but the quiet, undeniable acknowledgement of truth is sometimes the most satisfying of all. For years, I carried the weight of exclusion, of betrayal, of being deemed disposable. I let the world, or at least my own family, define my worth, assuming that love and recognition could be measured in wealth, approval, or convenience. That night, on the frozen marble steps, I realized how hollow those measures were. True strength, true value comes from within. From how we act when no one is watching, how we treat the most vulnerable, how we hold on to integrity even when the world seems to have turned its back. The woman on the bench, Madame Odora Street Claire, showed me that even when life strips you of everything, kindness and courage create ripples you can't always see immediately. Giving away my coat, something I thought was all I had left, reminded me that the smallest acts of generosity can unlock doors we didn't even know were there. Within an hour, 19 black BMWs appeared, not as a miraculous fairy tale, but as a testament to the invisible power of selflessness combined with resilience. And the family? Seeing them confront themselves, their arrogance exposed, their carefully curated illusions shattered, it was more than revenge. It was a mirror held up to years of neglect, favoritism, and entitlement. They had the choice to respond with bitterness, with defiance, with excuses, but the exposure of truth left no room for pretense. Watching the subtle recognition settle over them, the understanding that actions have consequences, gave me a deeper satisfaction than any moment of retaliation ever could. This story isn't just mine. It's for anyone who's ever felt discarded, ignored, or underestimated. For those who've been betrayed by people they trusted most, who've been told they're not enough, who've seen the ones they love elevate someone else above them. Life can feel unbearably cruel at times, but the very act of survival, of rising above, of turning pain into strategy and strength, can create the most profound victories. I learned that revenge, when fueled by rage alone, is temporary. But when it's guided by clarity, patience, and deliberate action, it becomes transformative, not just for the person wronged, but for everyone involved. It doesn't need to humiliate or harm. It doesn't need to punish violently. Its power lies in subtlety, intelligence, and the undeniable truth of exposure. And here's the part one want you to take with you. When life knocks you down, when doors close and loved ones turn away, when the world seems determined to remind you of your vulnerabilities, don't lose yourself. Find the quiet strength inside, act with integrity, and trust that the universe has a way of balancing scales in ways you may not immediately recognize. Your resilience, your kindness, and your ability to see clearly in the chaos are more powerful than you think. So tonight, I leave you with this reflection. Life's ultimate payback is not always in confrontation. Sometimes it's in quietly reclaiming your own worth, showing up stronger than ever, and letting the consequences of others' actions speak for themselves. Trust me, the feeling is indescribable. That release, that satisfaction, is something no amount of anger or aggression can replicate. It's pure, it's lasting, and it's yours the moment you decide to stand tall despite betrayal. Now, if this story resonated with you, if it gave you that rush of seeing justice quietly delivered, there are a few things you can do to keep the energy going. First, hit that like button. Sharing support lets me know these stories matter to you, and it fuels the creation of even more content that dives deep into the psychology of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. Next, subscribe to the channel. If you've ever been backstabbed, underestimated, or dismissed, you're not alone. And subscribing ensures you get every epic tale of justice, clever strategy, and emotional triumph. Finally, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you loved or trusted? How did you rise above it? Sharing your experience might help someone else realize that they're not alone, and that even in the darkest moments, strength and justice are possible. And if you want to continue the journey, check out the next video, another tale of cunning, resilience, and ultimate vindication. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. The strategies, the emotional depth, the psychological tension, it's all there, waiting for you. Remember this, strength is quiet, resilience is powerful, and justice is often subtle but undeniable. Stand tall, act with clarity, and never forget that even the smallest act of integrity can create ripples that change everything. Life has a way of rewarding patience, kindness, and intelligence, sometimes in ways we least expect, but always in ways that last. So go on, carry that with you. Keep your heart strong, your mind sharp, and your actions deliberate. And whenever someone underestimates you, whenever betrayal feels unbearable, remember, the universe has a way of making things right. You just have to be patient enough, wise enough, and brave enough to witness it.